Hi there, and welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we invite you to step into the world of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, the handsome gangster who dreamed of turning a dusty desert into a neon empire. A man who built Las Vegas before the world even believed it could exist. He was charming, ruthless, and untouchable, until the dream he created became the reason he died. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? We love watching this outlaw community grow across cities, countries, and sleepless nights. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join the Outlaw Icons family. Every week, we uncover another legend who shaped the underworld. One crime, one empire, one whisper at a time. Now, take a deep breath. Let the noise of the day drift away, and follow us back to the smoky lounges, silent deals, and bloody dreams of the American Mafia. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Chapter 1. The Streets of Brooklyn, 1906 to 1920. Under the flickering streetlights of Brooklyn, a boy ran through the shadows, thin, fast, fearless. The year was 1916, and the world was changing faster than the trains that roared above the streets of Williamsburg. The boy's name was Benjamin Siegel, though no one called him that. Around here, he was just Ben, the scrappy kid with wild blue eyes and a temper that came like thunder, sudden, sharp, and unforgettable. He didn't know it yet, but those eyes would one day look out across the Nevada desert and see a city of lights rising where nothing but dust had lived before. But for now, his world was brick walls, broken bottles, and the smell of bread from his mother's tiny kitchen. He was born in 1906, the son of Jewish immigrants from Galicia, a rough corner of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. His father worked endless hours in a clothing factory. His mother took in laundry. Their apartment was a cramped space filled with the constant hum of survival. Neighbors yelling in Yiddish, the hiss of a gas stove, the baby's cry that never stopped. Poverty didn't just live there, it ruled. And Benjamin, even as a boy, hated that rule. He'd watch his father's hands, rough and red from labor, and swear to himself that he'd never end up that way. Money wasn't just a dream to him. It was freedom, something he could feel but never touch. The streets of Brooklyn in those years were an education in their own right. The police walked with nightsticks, not respect. Street corners belonged to whoever could hold them. Fights broke out over everything. Marbles, nickels, pride. Benjamin learned quickly that fear was a language, and he became fluent early. His fists did the talking, and his reputation spread. The Irish gangs ruled one block, the Italians another, but the Jewish kids, they had nothing organized yet. They were outnumbered, underestimated, and often pushed around. That didn't sit right with him. One winter afternoon, when the snow turned to slush and the factory whistles blew, Benjamin met another boy who would change everything. Meyer Lansky was quiet where Benjamin was loud, calculating where Benjamin was impulsive. The two seemed opposite, but something clicked between them like gears in a machine. They shared the same hunger, not just for money, but for respect. Together, they became the kind of partnership that would later be whispered about in every dark alley and police report on the East Coast. Their first hustles were small. Protection rackets on street vendors, fake insurance schemes, and bootleg operations that barely qualified as criminal, at least by the standards they'd later set. Benjamin handled the muscle. Meyer handled the math. When someone refused to pay, Benjamin's rage came out like a spark catching oil. He didn't talk much before throwing a punch. That temper earned him the nickname Bugsy, though he hated it. To him, it sounded like mockery, a word that suggested he was unhinged. But to everyone else, it was perfect. He was fast, unpredictable, dangerous, like a lit fuse waiting for flame. The Prohibition era was just beginning, and with it came a new economy built on risk and alcohol. The streets were about to turn into rivers of illegal whiskey, and Benjamin and Meyer were already building the boats. By 1920, speakeasies were opening in every neighborhood, and bootleggers became the new aristocrats of the underworld. The cops were either bought or blind, and those who weren't didn't live long. It was a new kind of capitalism, brutal, direct, and free of pretense. And the kids from Williamsburg wanted in. Benjamin had a knack for seeing opportunity where others saw danger. When the Italian gangs began muscling into Jewish neighborhoods, he didn't run. He organized. Together with Meyer, he formed a crew. Young, reckless men who carried pistols like accessories and treated crime like business. They weren't interested in petty theft. They wanted control. They called themselves the Bugs and Meyer mob, a name that sounded almost cartoonish, but on the streets, it carried weight. Their reputation spread through Brooklyn like smoke after a gunshot. Precision, loyalty, and brutality, that was their brand. If someone crossed them, the message was delivered personally and violently. There's a story from those early years, part truth, part legend, about a rival who tried to undercut their liquor route. One night, Benjamin found him hiding in a tenement basement. The man begged for his life, stammering promises of repayment. Benjamin stared at him, calm, cold, then smiled. "You think words fix things?" he said quietly. No one ever saw that man again. To Benjamin, it wasn't about rage anymore. It was about principle, control, reputation, order. Fear became his currency, and he spent it freely. But behind the violence was a strange charm. People liked him, even those who feared him. He dressed sharp, spoke fast, smiled often. He had this aura, the kind that made you think he could talk his way out of anything. And sometimes he did. Women were drawn to him. Men wanted to be near him, and cops couldn't decide whether to arrest him or shake his hand. It was charisma wrapped in danger, and it made him unforgettable. At home, things weren't as glamorous. His parents didn't understand the life he was building. His mother would light candles on Friday nights, praying for her son's safety, pretending not to notice the blood on his collar. His father stopped asking questions after a while. Benjamin would leave envelopes of money on the kitchen table, enough to pay rent, enough to buy silence. They didn't approve, but they didn't interfere. In those days, that was as close to support as a gangster could get. Meyer Lansky, always the strategist, began connecting with bigger names. The Italian crews were starting to unify under men like Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello. There was talk of creating a national network, an organized crime syndicate that operated like a business empire. Benjamin loved the sound of that. He wasn't content being just a neighborhood tough. He wanted to build something lasting, something people would remember. And for the first time, he saw himself not as a criminal, but as an entrepreneur, just one operating outside the law. Brooklyn, though, was changing. The city pulsed with energy, immigrants flooding in, factories expanding, the skyline growing taller every year. Opportunity was everywhere, but so was chaos. Gang wars erupted constantly. The streets ran red, and every corner was a turf line waiting to be crossed. The Bugs and Meyer mob survived by being smarter and faster. They didn't pick fights they couldn't win. When rivals came for them, they didn't shout. They acted. Silent, swift, efficient. The newspapers called them ghosts of the East Side. The police called them a menace. But everyone else, everyone who lived under their shadow, just called them inevitable. Benjamin was barely 20, but he already moved like someone who knew exactly who he was. He'd stand in smoky bars, laughing with bootleggers twice his age, and somehow command the room. There was something magnetic about him, that mix of danger and confidence that made people want to follow. And when he talked about the future, it wasn't about small-time scores. It was about cities, hotels, power. Why settle for crumbs, he'd say, when we could own the bakery? That hunger, that vision, was what separated him from the rest. Most men in his world wanted fast money and a short life. Benjamin wanted legacy. Even then, the seeds of his ambition were growing, wild and unstoppable. He didn't know what form it would take, not yet. But somewhere deep down, he felt the pull of something bigger than Brooklyn. The world beyond the bridge. That was where his future lived. Still, power comes with cost. The more control they took, the more enemies they made. The Irish gangs wanted revenge for old debts. The Italians demanded respect on their terms. And the police, tired of bribes and bullets, began cracking down harder than ever. One night, during a raid on a warehouse filled with illegal liquor, Benjamin barely escaped. He jumped from a second-story window, hit the pavement, and limped 3 blocks before collapsing behind a bakery. Blood stained his shirt, but he was laughing. "They'll never catch me," he muttered through clenched teeth. And they didn't. Not that night. Not for many nights to come. In the following months, he and Meyer expanded beyond Brooklyn, running routes through New Jersey and upstate New York. The profits grew, and so did their confidence. The Bugs and Meyer mob was no longer a small street outfit. It was an operation, disciplined, organized, profitable. They employed drivers, smugglers, accountants, even a lawyer who looked the other way. For a boy who once couldn't afford shoes, it was intoxicating. Money meant power, and power meant control. Control over life, death, and destiny. But control is an illusion, and the streets have a way of humbling even the boldest. Late one summer night, Benjamin stood on a rooftop overlooking the city. The skyline shimmered with light, 1,000 windows glowing against the dark. He thought about how far he'd come and how far he still wanted to go. The noise below, cars, horns, distant arguments, felt like music to him. Every sound was a promise, every shadow a possibility. But in that same darkness, there were men watching, waiting, planning. Every rising star casts a longer shadow, and Benjamin's was beginning to stretch across the entire city. As his legend grew, so did the whispers. Some said he was untouchable. Others said he was losing control. And in the middle of it all, he was still that kid from Williamsburg, restless, angry, dreaming of something beyond the streets. But the streets weren't done with him yet. Not by a long shot. One evening, Meyer approached him with a new proposition. There were talks among the higher-ups, a meeting of minds that could change everything, a way to unify the underworld, to stop the bloodshed and turn chaos into order. Luciano, Costello, Lansky, they were all part of it, and they wanted men like Benjamin on their side. It wasn't just about Brooklyn anymore. It was about building an empire. Benjamin listened, silent for once. The air between them felt heavy, electric. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had thrown fists, pulled triggers, and signed deals. An empire, he repeated softly, almost to himself. Then a grin spread across his face. "Yeah," he said, "let's build one." Outside, the streets buzzed with life, the smell of bread, smoke, and danger blending into the night. Brooklyn had raised him, shaped him, scarred him, but now it was too small to hold him. The boy who once ran through alleys with empty pockets was about to step into a new world, one where the stakes were higher, the money cleaner, and the consequences deadlier. Somewhere beyond those tenement rooftops, a city of lights waited to be born. But before Bugsy Siegel could build it, he'd have to survive the empire that taught him how to dream. Chapter 2: The Bugs and Meyer Mob. Learning the Trade, 1920 to 1925. The sound of rain against the tin rooftops of Brooklyn mixed with the hiss of whiskey bottles being opened in the dark. It was the early 1920s, and America was drunk on the idea of prohibition, a nation trying to stay dry while drowning itself in bootleg liquor. The law said alcohol was banned, but the streets said otherwise. For Benjamin Siegel and Meyer Lansky, it was the perfect storm, a time when risk could turn into riches overnight, when violence and vision walked hand in hand. In a city that never slept, the rules were simple. If you were fast, fearless, and ruthless enough, you could own a piece of it. And Siegel intended to own a lot more than that. He had grown sharper since his days running small hustles. The brawls, the standoffs, the constant threat of death, all of it had hardened him into something new. He wasn't just another street kid anymore. He was becoming a businessman, the kind who wore violence like a well-tailored suit, something elegant, dangerous, and perfectly fitted. Meyer, with his quiet mind and cold logic, complimented him in ways no one else could. Together, they had built something that didn't have a name at first, just a reputation. But soon, people started whispering about them, the Bugs and Meyer mob. It wasn't a gang in the traditional sense. It was an organization, efficient and disciplined, something that could only have been born from the chaos of Prohibition. They learned quickly that liquor wasn't just about drinking. It was about control. Every bottle moved through a chain of hands, from smugglers to distributors, from corrupt cops to bar owners. Whoever controlled the chain controlled the profit. Benjamin saw opportunity in every crack of the system. They started small, running trucks of Canadian whiskey through back roads, paying off policemen along the way. Sometimes the bribes worked, sometimes they didn't. When they didn't, Benjamin made sure the message was remembered. His temper had evolved into precision, not wild or reckless anymore, but calculated, like a blade honed for a specific cut. Their base of operations was a garage in Brownsville, a quiet front with a backroom that buzzed with deals. There were ledgers, phone calls, and envelopes of cash passed between trusted hands. The smell of oil and booze hung thick in the air. This was no longer street crime. It was enterprise. They were setting up supply lines, organizing crews, managing risk, all before they were even 20. In a way, they were creating the blueprint for modern organized crime before anyone had the language for it. And while Meyer ran the books, Benjamin ran the people. His presence alone was often enough to keep men loyal or terrified, usually both. They weren't operating in isolation. The Italian outfits were watching, as were the Irish. At first, the Jewish kids from Brooklyn were treated like outsiders, the newcomers who didn't belong in the established underworld hierarchy. But Benjamin refused to accept those boundaries. When a rival Irish crew tried to hijack one of their shipments near the docks, he led his men in a counterattack that would be talked about for years. They didn't just defend the load. They sent a message written in blood and broken bones. By dawn, the streets knew one thing clearly. The Bugs and Meyer mob wasn't to be crossed. That night, Benjamin and Meyer sat in silence, counting the money stacked neatly across the table. Outside, the city pulsed with sirens and distant laughter. "We're just getting started," Benjamin said quietly. There was no bravado in his voice, just certainty. He wasn't boasting. He was predicting. As Prohibition tightened its grip on the country, the opportunities multiplied. Illegal distilleries popped up everywhere, run by amateurs who didn't understand business or discretion. The Bugs and Meyer mob offer protection for a price. Those who paid thrived. Those who didn't soon regretted it. They created what was essentially an underground insurance system, one that made them both respected and feared. Benjamin saw himself as a kind of enforcer of order in a lawless time. If someone broke an agreement, he didn't call the police. He made sure justice was handled swiftly, sometimes in the quiet alley behind the bar, sometimes on a crowded street where the sound of a single gunshot could disappear into the city's noise. Violence was a tool, and he used it with purpose. But beneath it all, there was a code. Benjamin wasn't reckless about who he hurt. He targeted betrayal, not weakness. And that distinction mattered. In a world where everyone wanted to be powerful, he understood something deeper. Real power wasn't about fear alone. It was about control. He could walk into a room full of killers and make them listen without raising his voice. Meyer once said that Benjamin could talk a man into handing over his wallet and then thank him for the experience. It was charisma weaponized. But charisma didn't pay the bills alone. The logistics of smuggling became increasingly complex. They had to coordinate shipments from Canada, sometimes through the Great Lakes, sometimes by train. Each route was a gamble. Rival crews, federal agents, storms, betrayal. Yet, the profits were enormous. A single successful run could make more money than a man in the garment district earned in a year. Benjamin began dressing differently. Silk ties, fine suits, the kind of wardrobe that made him look more like a businessman than a gangster. He had always wanted respect, and now he had it. But he also had attention, and attention was dangerous currency. The police began taking notice of the elegant young man who always seemed to have cash, but never a job. Raids on warehouses increased, though somehow, Benjamin's operations always seemed to be one step ahead. Bribes helped, of course, but there was also something uncanny about his instinct. He could sense trouble before it arrived, like an animal that feels the shift in the wind before a storm. Meyer relied on numbers. Benjamin relied on intuition. Together, they made the impossible seem easy. They were soon making connections that would shape the next decade of American crime. Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, names that would become legends, were already forming alliances, breaking down the old barriers between ethnic gangs. The underworld was evolving from chaos into organization, from street brawls into boardrooms. And at the heart of it, the Bugs and Meyer mob became known as professionals, dependable, efficient, profitable. They weren't just muscle. They were businessmen who understood the value of structure. It was during one of these early partnerships that Benjamin got his first real taste of national power. Luciano saw something in him. The energy, the vision, the audacity. The Italians had long controlled the major bootlegging networks, but Benjamin's crew brought a new kind of efficiency. He and Meyer knew how to run things like a company, clean, fast, disciplined. They introduced systems, coded messages, supply tracking, decentralized routes. It was criminal innovation, years ahead of its time, and it worked. But success had its price. The violence escalated as other mobs tried to muscle in. There were shootings in the streets, disappearances that filled newspaper columns. Benjamin became both hunter and hunted. He slept with a pistol under his pillow, trusting no one completely except Meyer. Every handshake, every deal carried the weight of suspicion. Yet, he thrived in the chaos. The danger wasn't a burden. It was fuel. To him, fear was just proof that he was alive. There was a night when everything almost ended. A rival crew set up an ambush outside a warehouse near the docks. Benjamin walked into the trap unknowingly, surrounded before he even realized. Bullets ripped through the night air. One grazed his arm. Another shattered a bottle beside his head. He dove behind a crate, returned fire, and kept firing until the gun clicked empty. When the smoke cleared, 3 men lay dead. Benjamin stood up, blood running down his sleeve, eyes cold. "Tell them," he said to the only survivor, "I don't miss twice." The message spread faster than the news could print it. But there was something about that night that changed him. Maybe it was the brush with death, or maybe it was the realization that he was no longer invincible. From then on, he became more strategic, less visible, more dangerous. He learned that true power wasn't loud. It was quiet, invisible, like the pulse under a wrist. By 1923, the Bugs and Meyer mob was handling operations that spanned multiple states. They had connections in Chicago, Philadelphia, even as far as Florida. Benjamin began spending time in nicer hotels, meeting with men in suits instead of street corners. The world was opening up, and he wanted all of it. He started talking about expanding beyond bootlegging into gambling and construction, legitimate fronts for an illegitimate empire. Meyer listened, skeptical but intrigued. He knew Benjamin's ambitions could either make them untouchable or destroy them completely. And yet, there was no stopping him. The hunger that drove him as a boy had only grown sharper. He'd stare at the skyline at night and talk about the future, cities, hotels, lights stretching into the horizon. "The streets are too small," he'd say. "There's more out there. Bigger things." Meyer would shake his head, half amused, half worried. "You talk like a dreamer," he'd say. Benjamin would smile. Every empire starts as a dream. Their partnership became legend. Where Benjamin was fire, Meyer was ice. One led with instinct, the other with calculation. And between them, they created something unstoppable. But the larger they grew, the more dangerous their alliances became. Deals with Luciano and Costello meant deeper entanglement with the Italian Mafia, and with that came politics, betrayals, and obligations that couldn't be ignored. Benjamin had always prided himself on being independent, but the reality of power was compromise. To rise higher, he'd have to play their game, a game where mistakes were paid for in blood. There was also the law. The federal government was beginning to catch on to the scale of organized crime. Raids became more sophisticated, surveillance tighter. The newspapers ran stories about bootlegging empires, shadowy figures, and mysterious fortunes. The name Bugsy began appearing in print, though always in rumor. He hated seeing it, hated how it made him sound like a sideshow act rather than a man of vision. But in truth, the name stuck because it captured something real, that spark of madness that lived just beneath the charm. At home, he was trying to live two lives. He married Esta Krakower, his teenage sweetheart, and they had two daughters. He tried, for a time, to balance family with the underworld, but the streets always pulled him back. Nights turned into mornings, deals turned into wars, and soon his name carried more weight in the dark than it ever could in daylight. His wife wanted stability. He wanted immortality. It was a gulf that could never close. By 1925, the Bugs and Meyer mob had evolved from a neighborhood outfit into one of the most efficient criminal organizations in New York. They were feared, respected, and, most importantly, indispensable. Luciano and Lansky began laying the groundwork for what would soon become the National Crime Syndicate, a unified network of Italian and Jewish mobsters working together. And Benjamin, with his sharp suits and sharper mind, was right at the heart of it. But beneath the success, something restless stirred in him. The city that once seemed limitless was starting to feel small again. The police pressure was mounting, rival gangs were merging, and the streets felt suffocating. He had mastered Brooklyn, conquered its chaos, but now he wanted something more refined, something grander. He dreamed of places where the sun burned against gold sand, where power didn't come from bullets, but from vision. He didn't know it yet, but the path that began in those backstreets would one day lead him to the desert, a place where he'd build a monument that would outlive every gunshot he ever fired. For now, though, the night still belonged to him. The whiskey flowed, the money piled, and the city trembled under the quiet reign of two boys who had turned crime into an art form. But the higher he climbed, the closer the edge became. And somewhere in the darkness, men with sharper knives and colder hearts were already watching, waiting for their turn to cut the dream short. The empire was growing, but empires, especially the criminal kind, never grow without blood. Chapter 3: The Rise of the Syndicate, 1925 to 1931. The night was heavy with rain, and the city shimmered like a mirage under streetlights. Somewhere in a smoke-filled backroom above a Manhattan nightclub, a meeting was taking place that would quietly change the shape of organized crime forever. The air was thick with cigar smoke and tension. Italians, Jews, and Irish sat together for the first time. Men who once shot at each other now shared whiskey and promises. And among them, calm but electric, was Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. He was no longer the scrappy kid from Brooklyn. He was something else now, a man who had seen the game evolve and knew he belonged at the top of it. He wasn't just building a crew anymore. He was helping to build an empire. By 1925, Prohibition had turned crime into a full-fledged industry. What started as chaos, rival gangs shooting each other over barrels of bootleg liquor, was now becoming a business with structure, management, and rules. And the men behind it weren't satisfied with local power. They wanted national reach. Lucky Luciano saw it first, that old-school gang wars were bad for business. He wanted a syndicate, a system where money mattered more than bloodlines, and efficiency replaced tradition. And for that vision to work, he needed men like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Siegel, the Jewish enforcers who had already proven they could turn brutality into profit and discipline into dominance. Bugsy wasn't a man who liked meetings, but he understood their importance. He wasn't interested in titles or formalities. What mattered to him was momentum. The streets were changing, and he refused to be left behind. The Bugs and Meyer mob had evolved into something larger, an organization that moved money across states, bought off judges, bribed politicians, and even reached into law enforcement. The city was their chessboard now, and Benjamin had become one of its most unpredictable players, the kind who could make a move no one saw coming until it was already too late. He had charisma that drew men in and fear that kept them there. At those gatherings of gangland leaders, he spoke rarely, but with weight. He didn't waste words. When others argued, he'd lean back in his chair, eyes half closed, listening. And when he finally did speak, the room went silent. The war's over, he said once, his tone steady. "From now on, we make money, not headlines." It was a simple statement, but it carried the new gospel of organized crime. The days of reckless street killings were ending. The new underworld was corporate, and Bugsy was one of its architects. The alliance between Luciano, Lansky, and Siegel would come to define an era. Luciano brought vision and organization. Lansky brought brains and calculation, and Siegel brought muscle and charisma. It was a trinity of control, each man playing a role the others couldn't. Together, they began consolidating power, breaking down the old guard of Mafia bosses who clung to the old ways of Sicilian loyalty and blood oaths. Siegel, though not Italian, became one of the most trusted enforcers of Luciano's empire. He was the embodiment of the new breed, cosmopolitan, polished, and ruthlessly efficient. The prohibition business was still the foundation of their fortune. Booze flowed across the borders in massive quantities, hidden in trains, trucks, and even funeral processions. Federal agents tried to clamp down, but corruption ran deep. Politicians were bought, judges paid, and newspapers silenced. It was a machine that fed itself, and Siegel, always restless, wanted to expand its gears. He oversaw the enforcement side, making sure shipments arrived, debts were paid, and rivals disappeared quietly. He wasn't just a killer anymore. He was a manager of violence. His men carried out orders with military precision. If someone crossed the syndicate, it wasn't a gunfight in the streets anymore. It was a vanishing act, clean, quiet, final. But even in this growing empire, Benjamin stood out. He had an aura that went beyond fear. There was something magnetic about him. The way he moved, the way he smiled, the way he turned crime into style. He didn't just enforce the rules. He made people believe in them. To his men, he was both leader and legend. To his enemies, he was a ghost that struck from nowhere. And to the women who crossed his path, he was danger disguised as charm. As money poured in, Benjamin began living the life he had once only dreamed of. The cheap suits and smoky backrooms were replaced by tailored jackets and fine restaurants. He bought a car that gleamed like a diamond under city lights and moved into better neighborhoods where he didn't have to look over his shoulder at every shadow. But even then, he couldn't escape the pulse of violence that had built him. He'd go from dining with businessmen in Midtown to handling disputes with gangsters in dingy basements. It was a double life that suited him perfectly. One foot in elegance, the other in blood. The Bugs and Meyer mob had by now become the enforcement backbone of the syndicate. When Luciano or Costello needed something handled quickly and without noise, they called Benjamin. He was fast, effective, and loyal. The kind of man who could turn a volatile situation into order or chaos, depending on what was required. Rumors circulated about his involvement in key hits during the Castellamarese War, the brutal conflict that tore through the Italian underworld between 1929 and 1931. It was a war of ambition and betrayal, a reshuffling of power that left bodies in the streets and the old guard in coffins. Benjamin moved through it like a ghost, always in motion, never caught. That war ended with the rise of Luciano and the formation of what would become known as the Commission, a governing body for organized crime. It was the beginning of the syndicate's golden age, and Siegel had helped carve it into existence. But to get there, he'd crossed lines that could never be uncrossed. The most notorious was the elimination of Joe Masuria and later Salvatore Maranzano, two bosses who refused to adapt to the new order. Though Benjamin wasn't the triggerman, his presence in those circles of plotting was undeniable. He was there in the smoke and whispers, a hand guiding the blade from the shadows. Through all of it, Meyer remained his anchor. Lansky was the calm in the storm, the man who saw numbers where others saw blood. Together they built networks that reached far beyond New York. They invested in racetracks, nightclubs, and casinos, legal fronts for illegal empires. They were building infrastructure, not chaos. And for a time, it seemed like nothing could stop them. Yet, there was always something restless about Benjamin. The money came fast, but so did the danger. He was making enemies faster than allies. The Irish gangs still wanted revenge for old grudges. Federal agents kept files with his name underlined in red, and some of the Italians, despite his usefulness, never trusted him fully. He wasn't one of them, and in a world built on loyalty and bloodlines, that always mattered. Still, Luciano kept him close, and Lansky's loyalty ensured his place was secure, for now. The Prohibition years were ending, though, and that changed everything. By 1933, the ban on alcohol was lifted. For most bootleggers, that was the end. The easy money dried up overnight. But for the syndicate, it was just a pivot point, an opportunity to evolve. Luciano and Lansky began shifting their focus to other ventures: narcotics, gambling, prostitution, labor racketeering. The machine didn't stop. It just changed shape. Benjamin adapted effortlessly. Where others saw loss, he saw a new horizon. Gambling, especially, fascinated him. There was something poetic about it. The illusion of chance, the dance between risk and reward. It mirrored his own life too perfectly. Even before the repeal, Benjamin had already started experimenting with gambling dens hidden behind legitimate fronts. He understood something most people would always crave escape. Whether through alcohol, cards, or risk, it didn't matter. The desire to forget was as profitable as the liquor trade had ever been. And in that understanding lay the seed of something bigger, something that would one day glow under the desert sky. But that future was still a distant mirage. For now, Benjamin's world was New York, a city of money and murder, where every handshake was both opportunity and trap. His power was growing, but so was his isolation. The higher he climbed, the fewer people he could trust. The same charm that drew allies also bred jealousy. Men whispered behind his back, saying he was too flashy, too reckless, too dangerous to be controlled. Some called him a liability, others a genius. Both were right. He had started to believe in his own myth. He'd walk into clubs, his presence turning heads, his smile disarming even those who despised him. He could switch from warmth to cold in a heartbeat, and people never knew which version of him they'd get. That unpredictability was both his weapon and his weakness. Those closest to him, even Lansky, began to sense the volatility that lay beneath the surface. It was as if the same fire that made him magnetic was slowly consuming him from the inside. One night, after a long meeting with Luciano's men, Benjamin stepped outside into the cold air. The city was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. He stood under a street lamp, staring at his reflection in a rain puddle. The face staring back was handsome, sharp, confident, but there was something in the eyes. A flicker of exhaustion, maybe, or the early shadows of paranoia. In the underworld, success didn't come without ghosts. And Benjamin had plenty. By 1931, the syndicate was stronger than ever. The old world of crime families had transformed into a nationwide operation with its own council, its own economy, its own silent government. They called it the Combination, or simply the Syndicate. Its influence reached from New York to Chicago, from Miami to Cleveland. And at its edges stood Bugsy Siegel, enforcer, entrepreneur, and symbol of everything new about organized crime. He had gone from street thug to statesman of the underworld. Yet the thing about power is that it never feels like enough. He began to crave something different, something cleaner, something that could outlive the constant bloodshed. The violence had lost its thrill. He wanted to build, not destroy. But the world he inhabited didn't allow for clean exits. Once you were part of the syndicate, you didn't retire. You adapted or you died. Benjamin's mind was already drifting westward. California, he thought, was a place where a man could reinvent himself. Sunlight instead of smoke. Glamour instead of grit. It was a fantasy then, but one that grew stronger with every deal, every near miss, every silent threat that followed him home. The rise of the syndicate marked the peak of Benjamin's power in New York, but it also marked the beginning of his departure. The city that had made him rich was now too crowded with enemies. The walls were closing in, not from the law, but from within. There were whispers that Luciano's new order didn't have room for everyone, and Benjamin, for all his charm, was too volatile, too visible. He knew it, and like all great survivors, he was already planning his escape. On a late summer evening, he met with Meyer one last time before heading west. They sat in a small restaurant, the kind where the waiters knew to keep their distance. The conversation was quiet, measured, almost tender. They didn't talk about business. They talked about what they had built, what they had lost, and what came next. Meyer warned him that Los Angeles wasn't like New York, that Hollywood could eat a man alive in ways bullets never could. Benjamin smiled. "I'm not going there to be eaten," he said. "I'm going there to build something they'll never forget." When he walked out that night, the city seemed to hum behind him, the streets pulsing with memories of all the ghosts he'd made. He was leaving the empire he helped create to chase another dream, one that shimmered far beyond the skyline. The syndicate would go on without him, stronger and bloodier than ever. But Benjamin Siegel was done being just another name in the underworld. He wanted to be a legend, and legends, as he would soon prove, aren't born in the streets. They're built in the desert. Chapter 4, Murder Incorporated and the Making of a Killer, 1931 to 1935. The dawn broke gray over Brooklyn, the kind of morning where the light looked tired before it even touched the streets. A city waking up to another day of deals and debts, where every handshake carried a shadow. For Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, those years marked a turning point, the moment when ambition and blood began to blend into something indistinguishable. The underworld had changed, and so had he. The gang wars were over, the syndicate was established, and now came the era of efficiency. No more street brawls or chaotic shootouts. Murder, from here on, would be an industry, systematic, organized, and invisible. It was the logical next step in the evolution of crime, and Benjamin was right in the center of it. They called it Murder Incorporated, though no one inside used that name. It was the creation of necessity, the enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate. Luciano and Lansky had built a structure, but it was men like Louis Lepka Buckleter and Albert Anastasia who ran the operation day to day. They needed soldiers who could kill cleanly, without hesitation, and without questions. Benjamin had already proven he was more than capable of that. To the newspapers, it sounded like a terrifying myth. But to the men who knew better, it was just business. When the syndicate needed to remove someone, a witness, a rival, a thief, or even a disloyal friend, the order went through channels. The result was always the same: silence. Benjamin was never a full-time hitman, but he was part of the circle that controlled them. He didn't pull every trigger, but he knew who did, when, and why. It was his influence that gave the operation its shape, a blend of discipline and flair that matched his own style. When he did handle a job personally, it wasn't rage that drove him anymore. It was precision. He treated murder like a trade, a form of craftsmanship. In his mind, a messy kill was a sign of weakness. He believed that control, even in violence, was what separated professionals from amateurs. "It's not about killing," he once told a close associate. "It's about keeping order. You let chaos in, you lose everything." That philosophy was what made him dangerous. He didn't enjoy killing, not in the way psychopaths did. For him, it was maintenance, a tool of management. He had become the embodiment of the syndicate's new world, sharp, modern, and merciless. Brooklyn was still his base, but his reach extended far beyond. The bootlegging days had given way to broader rackets, gambling, extortion, labor unions, narcotics. The money flowed through fronts and fake businesses, through laundries and shipping companies, all of it tied to the same invisible web. Benjamin oversaw parts of it like a regional manager in a corporation, except his reports were written in fear and paid in blood. He had become something of a celebrity in criminal circles. His clothes, his cars, his women, all reflected a man who had climbed beyond the gutter. He was known for arriving at meetings in silk suits, his hair slicked perfectly back, his cufflinks catching the light. Even men who hated him admitted he looked like someone born to command. But beneath the polish, The violence still burned, just more contained. He could be charming one second and deadly the next, shifting moods like a switchblade opening. People learned to read his silences, the stillness before the storm. In those years, Murder Incorporated operated out of a candy store in Brooklyn owned by a man named Abe Ellis. To the outside world, it looked harmless, but inside it was a control center for death. Orders came in quietly, sometimes coded, sometimes whispered. The killers were paid per job, usually a few $100s, small money for big consequences. Benjamin wasn't in that candy store every day, but when he walked in, even the toughest hitmen straightened up. His approval mattered. He was the connection between the top bosses and the enforcers, the bridge between brains and blood. He'd look over the operations with the cold eye of someone inspecting machinery. If the machine jammed, he fixed it, personally. There's a story, half rumor and half truth, about a man named Harry Greenberg, a former associate who turned unreliable. Word spread that Greenberg was talking too much, threatening to expose operations. Benjamin didn't hesitate. He tracked Greenberg down, calm and methodical, the way a hunter studies a wounded animal. When they finally found him, Benjamin reportedly stood over him, staring for a long time before pulling the trigger. It wasn't personal, it was policy. That was the chilling part. It was the professionalism of it all. He didn't flinch, didn't boast, didn't even linger. He walked away, hand steady, coat unwrinkled, as if he'd just signed off a deal. That was the paradox of Benjamin Siegel. He wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. He was civil, almost courtly. He could hold a conversation about art, then order a killing before dessert. He lived in both worlds with the same ease. One foot in high society, one in hell. His friends in legitimate business admired him. His friends in the underworld feared him. But everyone respected him. In a time when criminals were often crude and loud, Benjamin moved with a strange grace. He was redefining what a gangster could look like, less brute, more businessman. It was the image that would one day make him the perfect face for a different kind of empire. But for now, New York was his playground, and the rules were written in blood. The syndicate structure depended on fear, and Benjamin was one of the pillars holding it up. He had earned Meyer Lansky's absolute trust, and through Lansky, Luciano's as well. They relied on his ability to make problems disappear without leaving traces. If someone stole from the operation, if a rival made too much noise, if a deal went sour, Benjamin handled it. No theatrics, no witnesses, no bodies found. Just absence. He was also deeply involved in controlling the unions, one of the syndicate's most profitable ventures. Labor racketeering was the new frontier, a way to control industries without owning them. Dock workers, truckers, construction crews, all of them paid dues to the mob, whether they knew it or not. Benjamin used the same tactics he had honed on the streets, intimidation balanced with persuasion. He'd walk into a meeting of union leaders with that disarming smile, speaking softly, promising protection and prosperity. Those who refused soon realized that protection wasn't optional. Within months, the syndicate controlled shipping routes, supply lines, and warehouses across the eastern seaboard. Benjamin's influence was everywhere and nowhere, like smoke in a locked room. Still, even at his height, the violence haunted him. The ghosts of the men he'd killed or ordered killed lingered in his dreams. Sometimes, he'd wake in the middle of the night, sweating, reaching for a pistol that wasn't there. He rarely talked about it, but those close to him noticed the cracks forming. His temper grew sharper, his patience shorter. He'd snap over small things, then apologize a moment later, as if nothing had happened. Meyer tried to keep him grounded, but even he could see Benjamin's edges fraying. Power does that to men. It corrodes slowly, quietly, until the gleam turns to rust. Outside of the underworld, the country was changing. The Great Depression had turned America desperate. While ordinary people stood in bread lines, the syndicate thrived. Crime, ironically, became one of the few stable industries. Money still flowed in from gambling, loan sharking, and union rackets. Politicians secretly courted men like Luciano and Lansky for funding. Benjamin watched it all with amusement. the hypocrisy of it. The same men who condemned crime publicly relied on it privately. To him, that was proof that the system itself was just another racket. Everyone was hustling, just on different levels. He also began to think more about image, how power was perceived. He started mingling with actors, producers, and nightclub owners. The world of entertainment fascinated him because it mirrored his own, illusion built on control. He'd sit in dimly lit lounges, watching singers perform under spotlights, and imagine a future where crime and glamour coexisted openly. To him, there was no real difference between a movie star and a mob boss. Both sold fantasies. Both needed audiences. He wanted to be the kind of figure people whispered about not just out of fear, but fascination. But fascination breeds attention, and attention invites danger. The more visible Benjamin became, the more vulnerable he was. The police had started connecting dots, the newspapers began printing names, and the old guard of the mob grew uneasy with his growing celebrity. Men like Lepka Buckleter valued invisibility. Benjamin was becoming too bright a light. There were murmurs in backrooms that he was getting sloppy, that he talked too much, spent too much, showed too much. He dismissed them as jealousy, but deep down, he knew visibility was a double-edged sword. Still, he couldn't help himself. For a boy who had grown up in the shadows of poverty, attention felt like vindication. His personal life was unraveling too. His marriage was crumbling under the weight of late nights and constant danger. Esta had grown tired of the double life, the phone calls that came at odd hours, the whispers that followed him everywhere. Benjamin tried to make it work, buying gifts, making promises, but his world didn't allow for peace. The streets demanded too much. Love, in his life, was always temporary, a luxury that couldn't survive the paranoia. In the midst of it all, one thing remained constant: his friendship with Meyer Lansky. They had started together, and despite their differences, they remained bound by loyalty. Meyer saw Benjamin as both an asset and a burden. Brilliant, fearless, but unpredictable. He tried to steer him toward stability, to temper the recklessness with reason. But Benjamin was built for movement. Stillness made him restless. He needed momentum, risk, the next big thing. He couldn't stay in one place too long, not even in power. By 1935, Murder Incorporated had become an unstoppable force. It was said that hundreds of hits were carried out under its system, all sanctioned, all efficient. The police had no idea how to stop it. Witnesses vanished, informants turned up dead, and cases went cold before they even began. It was a perfect storm of fear and organization, and Benjamin was part of the invisible architecture holding it up. Yet, even in that dominance, he sensed a shift coming. The syndicate was evolving again, stretching beyond New York, looking westward. There were whispers of new ventures, new money, new territories untouched by law or rival. And the place everyone was beginning to talk about, quietly, almost as myth, was California. Hollywood was booming. Gambling was spreading underground in Los Angeles. Celebrities mingled with bootleggers, politicians with mobsters. The city had money, glamour, and just enough corruption to make it fertile ground. Meyer had already started planting roots there, using middlemen to explore opportunities. He told Benjamin about it, and Benjamin listened with growing fascination. Out there, Meyer said, they don't know what real control looks like. They think they're running things, but they're amateurs. Benjamin smiled. He could already picture it. Palm trees, movie stars, and a new kind of empire. Maybe it's time for a change of scenery, he said softly. That was how it began, not with a grand decision, but a whisper between friends. The move west wasn't just business. It was destiny. He'd conquered New York's underworld, reshaped its violence, and built his name into legend. But legends can't stay still. The city that once made him powerful was now suffocating him. He needed a new stage, one bright enough to match his ambition. And so, with the same calm certainty that had carried him through years of blood and betrayal, Benjamin Siegel prepared to leave the world he had mastered behind. The streets of Brooklyn that had raised him, the backrooms that had crowned him, the shadows that had hidden him. All of it would become memory. Ahead lay something different, something shimmering. A city of illusion, of light, of reinvention. But he carried something with him. The discipline of Murder Incorporated, the precision of its cold efficiency, the understanding that power isn't about noise, but silence. He was no longer just a gangster. He was a strategist, an architect of fear, and a man with a vision too big for one city. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that what he would build next wouldn't just make money. It would make history. The rain that morning had stopped, leaving the streets slick and shining like black glass. Benjamin stepped out of the candy store for the last time, lighting a cigarette as the smoke curled around him. Time to head west, he murmured to no one in particular. Behind him, Brooklyn exhaled, as if relieved and afraid all at once. Ahead, the horizon waited. He didn't know it yet, but every step he took from that day forward was leading him toward the desert, toward the dream that would one day define him, and toward the bullet that would end it. Chapter 5. Hollywood Calling, 1935 to 1937. The train that carried Benjamin Bugsy Siegel across America cut through the landscape like a blade, slicing east from New York toward the golden glow of California. Through the window, he watched the country change, factories giving way to fields, fields to deserts, and deserts to the endless horizon that promised something new. For most men, it was just a journey. For him, it was a transformation. He wasn't running from anything, not exactly. He was evolving, shedding the weight of New York's cold streets for the sunlight of a different empire, one built not on smoke and blood, but on illusion and opportunity. He could almost feel it in the air as the train rolled west. The future had a different color out here. Hollywood was unlike any place he had ever seen. The first time he stepped off the train at Union Station, the air smelled of orange blossoms, gasoline, and dreams. The streets sparkled with chrome cars and painted smiles. Men wore suits, even in the heat. Women floated by like silver screen ghosts in satin dresses. The buildings rose out of palm trees and dust, each one pretending to be more important than it was. Benjamin looked around and smiled to himself. This wasn't just a city, it was a stage. And if there was one thing he understood, it was performance. Los Angeles in the mid-30s was a magnet for hustlers, visionaries, and liars. It was a city built on reinvention, and that suited him perfectly. To the east, his name meant danger. Out here, it meant mystery. Few people knew his full story, and that gave him power. He began quietly, checking in with Meyer Lansky's contacts, small gambling outfits, horse race fixers, bookmakers who catered to studio executives after hours. Hollywood's nightlife was overflowing with money and vice. Stars drank, directors gambled, producers made backroom deals that blurred the line between fantasy and corruption. And everywhere there was profit to be made, Benjamin saw a way in. He rented a home in Beverly Hills, the kind with manicured hedges and white walls that caught the morning sun. His neighbors were actors and directors, people who lived lives that looked perfect but weren't. He fit right in. At first glance, no one would have guessed he was one of the most dangerous men in America. He was charming, clean-cut, impeccably dressed, and always smiling. He went to parties, shook hands with movie stars, and flirted with producers' wives. His accent was soft, his laugh genuine. He could make anyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. It was his gift, the same one that had made him indispensable in New York, and it worked even better here. But underneath that smile, his mind never stopped calculating. Every introduction, every conversation was an opportunity. He started attending horse races at Santa Anita, sitting beside studio heads who bet more in one afternoon than most men earned in a year. He'd talk fast, crack jokes, charm them into feeling safe, and then offer to handle their action discreetly. Within months, Benjamin was running high-stakes betting operations for Hollywood's elite. He knew their secrets, who was sleeping with who owed money, who needed silence. And in a city where reputation was everything, silence was gold. Still, it wasn't just money that drew him in. It was the glamour, the way people lit up when they saw him, the sense of being part of something bigger than crime. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just feared, he was admired. He was the handsome gangster who looked like he belonged on screen. Women noticed. Men wanted to drink with him. And Benjamin loved it. The violence, the deals, the bloodshed. It all felt far away now. In Los Angeles, he could play the gentleman, the investor, the socialite. Yet, he knew that behind every mansion and studio gate, the same hunger that ruled New York existed here too. It was just better dressed. His operations began to expand. He partnered with bookmakers and club owners, taking a cut from every illegal bet that crossed the city. The police, as always, could be persuaded to look the other way for the right price. He opened exclusive gambling dens hidden behind nightclubs and restaurants, places where actors, politicians, and mobsters mingled under low light. The money flowed freely, and with it came connections. George Raft, a Hollywood actor famous for playing gangsters, became one of his closest friends. Raft introduced him to the heart of the movie world. People who lived on fantasy, but craved danger. Benjamin gave them both. He started appearing at premiere parties, dressed to kill in tailored suits, his hair slicked back like the stars on the posters. Reporters called him the real-life Hollywood gangster, though few dared print his name outright. He smiled at the attention, but knew better than to believe it was harmless. Fame was a spotlight, and a spotlight can burn. Still, he couldn't resist. He loved being seen, loved the way people whispered when he walked in. To them, he was part myth, part movie, a character who didn't belong to any one world. And maybe he didn't. Behind the charm, the old Bugsy still lived. When someone crossed him, the mask dropped. There was a story of a small-time gambler who tried to cheat one of Benjamin's games in downtown Los Angeles. The man was found days later, beaten so badly he could barely speak. No one ever connected it to Siegel, at least not officially, but everyone understood the message. Behind that movie star smile was the same man who had once ruled Brooklyn's streets through fear and precision. You could admire him, you could even laugh with him, but you never crossed him. In those days, Virginia Hill entered his life like a thunderstorm. She was an actress, a courtesan, and a woman as volatile as he was. They met at a party thrown by one of Raft's friends, a blur of champagne, cigarette smoke, and music that never stopped. She had red hair, sharp wit, and eyes that burned with the same fire he carried. When they talked, the world seemed to shrink until it was just the two of them, matching tempers and trading barbs like lovers who already knew how the story would end. She saw in him what others didn't, a man trying to rise above his past. And he saw in her something intoxicating, chaos disguised as beauty. Their relationship was explosive from the start. They fought, they loved, they spent nights in luxury hotels and mornings arguing over control. But she fascinated him. Virginia wasn't afraid of him. She challenged him, provoked him, and yet she also understood the part of him that wanted to be something more than a gangster. She was the perfect partner for Hollywood, a woman who could charm anyone and lie with grace. Together, they became the city's most notorious couple, the gangster and the starlet, living a life that felt half real, half movie. Meanwhile, back in New York, the syndicate watched. Meyer Lansky kept tabs on his old friend, not because he doubted him, but because he understood him too well. Benjamin had a habit of getting lost in the world he built. Hollywood, with its money and temptation, was dangerous for a man like him. Yet Lansky knew he was the right choice to handle the West Coast. The syndicate needed a foothold here, and Benjamin's charisma opened doors no one else could. He wasn't just representing himself anymore. He was expanding their empire into the land of fame and fortune. But success in Los Angeles didn't come without enemies. Local gangs, old bootleggers, and corrupt cops all wanted their share. The city's underworld wasn't as organized as New York's. It was chaotic, fragmented. Benjamin saw that as an opportunity. He met with the local bosses, Mickey Cohen, Jack Dragna, Tony Cornero, and started forming alliances. Some respected him, others resented him, but all understood that he was different. He wasn't just another outsider trying to take over. He was a man with backing from the biggest criminal network in America. That alone made him untouchable. As his influence grew, so did the attention from law enforcement. federal agents began investigating gambling rings and illegal rackets connected to Hollywood's elite. Benjamin was questioned several times, but always walked out clean. He was too smart, too charming, and too well protected. Reporters followed him. Photographers caught him at parties, but nothing stuck. He had become a paradox. The gangster who never got caught, the criminal who looked more like a movie star than the men who played them. In public, he was the perfect gentleman. In private, he was calculating every move. He began thinking about something bigger, a permanent base, a legitimate front that could bring in massive profit without constant police interference. Gambling was his passion, but running it in shadows was exhausting. What if there was a place where it didn't have to be hidden? That question lingered in his mind, whispering to him like temptation itself. One evening, he sat on the balcony of his Beverly Hills home, looking out over the lights of Los Angeles. The city sparkled like scattered diamonds, a sea of promise stretching to the horizon. Virginia came up behind him, wrapped in silk, and asked what he was thinking. "The next big thing," he said softly. She laughed. "You always are." But his tone wasn't playful. He was serious. "There's a place out there," he said, nodding toward the distant desert. "A place where anything could happen." That night, he dreamed of lights, bright, blinding lights rising from sand, crowds of people laughing, the sound of dice rolling, and money flowing like water. It was only a dream then, but one that would soon become his obsession. Over the next year, his name became synonymous with the West Coast underworld. He expanded into construction rackets, loan sharking, even real estate. He knew politicians, actors, judges. The lines between criminal and celebrity blurred completely. When people saw him walking down Sunset Boulevard, they didn't whisper "gangster." They said, "That's Bugsy Siegel." The nickname he once hated now fit the myth he had become. It wasn't an insult anymore. It was a brand. Yet, for all the success, the cracks were showing. His temper was as quick as ever. He'd explode at employees for small mistakes, then apologize with gifts the next day. The pressure was building. The more power he gained, the more restless he became. He wasn't built to stay still. Meyer saw it coming before anyone else did. "You've got everything you ever wanted," Meyer told him during one visit. "But you're still looking for something you can't name." Benjamin smiled. "That's what keeps me alive." By 1937, he had everything: money, influence, reputation, and a woman who mirrored his madness. But beneath it all, there was a sense of unfinished business. Hollywood was glamorous, yes, but it wasn't his creation. He had walked into someone else's dream and made it his own. What he wanted now was something built from the ground up, something permanent. The desert was calling, whispering its silent promise of space, control, and reinvention. He began to hear about a small gambling town in Nevada, Las Vegas, they called it. At the time, it was little more than a handful of dusty streets and neon signs flickering against the emptiness. Legal gambling, wide-open laws, and endless land. Most people saw it as a novelty. Benjamin saw it as the future. The first time he heard the name, he said it out loud, letting it roll off his tongue. Las Vegas. It sounded exotic, dangerous, alive. He smiled. That's where it starts. Hollywood had made him a star, but Vegas would make him a legend. He didn't know it yet, but everything that followed, the glory, the betrayal, the empire, and the bullet, was already written in the glow of that idea. Out there, in the middle of nowhere, a new dream was waiting to be built. And Bugsy Siegel, the boy from Brooklyn who once fought for scraps, was ready to turn sand into gold. Chapter 6: The Hollywood Underworld, 1937 to 1940. The sun over Los Angeles glowed like a furnace, bleaching the sky white, baking the streets until the city shimmered like a mirage. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel stood in the courtyard of the Beverly Hills Hotel, sunglasses on, a cigarette burning between his fingers, watching a group of producers argue over box office numbers. He looked calm, composed, amused even. But behind those blue eyes, his mind was a machine, always calculating, always one step ahead. By 1937, He was no longer just a visitor in Hollywood. He was part of its bloodstream, the invisible current that ran beneath its glamour. The studios made the movies, but men like him controlled the night that followed them. Hollywood had its own kind of underworld, softer, prettier, but no less dangerous. Here, power wasn't enforced with bullets on street corners. It was whispered at dinner parties, sealed with handshakes and blackmail. And Siegel understood it perfectly. He'd built his empire on fear, but now he was learning to build it on influence. A word in the right ear, a favor exchanged, a debt collected quietly. This was a different kind of violence, one where charm was the weapon and silence the bullet. He'd mastered both. The studios were booming, the stars were untouchable, and the money flowing through Los Angeles was unlike anything he'd ever seen. Producers were spending fortunes on films and losing them in backroom games the same night. Siegel's gambling operations had become legendary among the Hollywood elite. He ran private rooms at the Clover Club on Sunset Boulevard and the Trocadero on the Strip, where movie stars and mobsters played side by side. Cash changed hands faster than dialogue in a screwball comedy, and Benjamin was always at the center of it, smiling, laughing, dealing cards with the precision of a man who never forgot who owed him. But he wasn't content to just skim profits. He wanted control. Through his network of bookmakers and fixers, he began to manipulate horse races, influence boxing matches, and muscle into the movie unions. The same man who once ruled Brooklyn's back alleys was now shaping the economy of an entire city from behind silk curtains. It wasn't about violence anymore. It was about leverage. He didn't need to threaten anyone when everyone owed him something. Still, the violence never disappeared completely. It just dressed better. There were quiet beatings behind casino walls, disappearances no one talked about, debts settled in the night. Benjamin wasn't the one pulling the triggers anymore, but his shadow was long, and his reach stretched across California. He had brought New York's discipline to the chaos of the West Coast. The syndicate noticed. They respected the results, but worried about his methods. He was drawing attention, and attention was bad for business. But Benjamin couldn't help himself. He had always been addicted to visibility. He liked to be seen, to be admired, to walk into a room and make silence fall like dust. His friendship with actor George Raft became a symbol of that duality. The gangster and the movie star, reflections of each other in different worlds. Raft opened doors that money couldn't, introducing Siegel to Hollywood's most powerful figures. Through him, Benjamin met directors, producers, studio heads, and politicians. Everyone wanted to be near him. There was something magnetic about a man who lived by his own rules and somehow made it look elegant. He threw parties at his Beverly Hills mansion that were the talk of the town. Cigarette smoke curling through laughter, jazz humming through the air, women in sequins leaning close to whisper secrets they'd regret in the morning. To outsiders, he was living the dream. But dreams, as he well knew, had a way of rotting from the inside. Virginia Hill was still at his side, fiery as ever, their relationship swinging between passion and destruction. They were drawn to each other like two storms colliding. When they were good, they were unstoppable, driving the coast in fast cars, dining with celebrities, flashing smiles that made cameras click. When they were bad, the walls shook. The fights were legendary, screaming matches that ended with broken glass, slammed doors, and long silences. But no matter how violent the arguments became, they always found their way back to each other. Maybe it was love, maybe it was addiction. Either way, neither could let go. By then, the syndicate's presence in Los Angeles was no secret. Meyer Lansky had planted roots quietly, investing in clubs, casinos, and racetracks. Luciano's network extended through every major city, and Siegel was the face of their West Coast branch, the ambassador of organized crime in the land of dreams. But he didn't just represent them. He wanted to outgrow them. He had the arrogance of a man who believed he could control destiny itself. He saw himself not as a criminal, but as a visionary, a businessman whose product just happened to be illegal. The world saw gangsters as thugs. He wanted to change that. He wanted the Mafia to have class. The city itself was changing too. The Great Depression had left scars, but Hollywood was immune. Its lights burned brighter than ever, distracting the country from hunger and war. But beneath the gloss, corruption ran deep. Studio bosses used mob-connected unions to crush strikes. Politicians took bribes to protect gambling dens. Even the police were divided, some on the syndicate's payroll, others too afraid to cross them. Benjamin navigated it all like a conductor leading an orchestra, knowing exactly when to raise his hand and when to let the chaos play. He spent his days in fine restaurants, Chasen's, Ciro's, the Brown Derby, places where deals were made over martinis and handshakes. Everyone wanted to be seen with him. He had the confidence of a man who didn't ask for power, but expected it. When he walked in, waiters straightened, actors smiled nervously, and women leaned closer. But there was always that edge beneath the charm, a sense that danger was never far away. People said his smile could turn a room warm or cold, depending on who you were. Yet, for all his success, cracks began to form. The federal government had started paying attention. They knew organized crime was spreading west, and Siegel's name appeared more and more in their files. The FBI didn't have enough to pin him, but they watched closely. He was questioned about gambling operations, about mob connections, about missing men. Each time, he walked out unscathed, his lawyers smiling, his suit immaculate. He'd shake hands with the agents, thank them for their time, and vanish into the night. But he knew the walls were inching closer. To make matters worse, tensions with other crime figures in Los Angeles were heating up. Jack Dragna, the Italian boss who considered himself the ruler of the city's underworld, resented Siegel's growing dominance. Their relationship was a dance of fake smiles and real threats. Dragna saw him as an intruder, a flashy outsider backed by distant powers. Siegel, on the other hand, saw Dragna as small-time, a relic of an old world that no longer mattered. Their rivalry simmered quietly but dangerously, each man watching the other for weakness. Around that same time, the idea that would define Siegel's legacy began to take shape. It started as Whispers, a new project in Nevada, a luxury hotel unlike anything that existed, a place where gambling could be legal and the profits endless. His friend William Wilkerson, a publisher and Hollywood entrepreneur, was the first to bring it up. He had purchased land outside Las Vegas and dreamed of building a resort for the Hollywood elite. Siegel listened with quiet fascination. Legal gambling, glamour, and distance from law enforcement. It was a vision made for him. But for now, it was just a conversation over drinks, an idea that floated somewhere between fantasy and inevitability. Back in Los Angeles, business continued. The gambling dens thrived, money flowed, and his influence grew deeper. He'd become a man who lived in two realities, the daylight world of movie stars and the shadow world of killers. He could dine with producers in the afternoon and issue an order for a hit before midnight. To him, there was no contradiction. It was all part of the same performance. The trick was keeping the lines from crossing. But life in the spotlight was dangerous for a man with his history. The newspapers started printing rumors, stories about his lavish parties, his gambling empire, his connection to the East Coast mob. He became a symbol of both fascination and fear, the gangster who looked like a leading man. Even those who despised him couldn't look away. Reporters wanted interviews, studios whispered about films inspired by his life, and the public devoured every rumor. It was the kind of fame that no gangster had ever had before. But fame, like power, is never free. Virginia warned him often. She saw how the attention made enemies multiply. "You think they love you," she said one night after another argument. "They don't. They're waiting for you to fall." He smiled, lighting a cigarette, his eyes cold behind the smoke. "Then let them wait," he said. "I'll fall when I'm ready." He believed that. He believed in his own invincibility, the same way he always had. But the cracks were widening. Some of his associates began to question his judgment. He spent too much money, trusted too easily, and angered too many people. The syndicate wanted results, not headlines. They had built their power on invisibility. Benjamin seemed determined to do the opposite. Lansky tried to rein him in, sending warnings through intermediaries. But Siegel brushed them off. "You don't build an empire by hiding," he said. "You build it by making them look." And so he kept building. His businesses, his image, his legend. By 1940, Los Angeles belonged to him in ways that couldn't be seen on maps. His reach extended from the movie sets to the racetracks, from the mansions in the hills to the dive bars downtown. Every dollar that changed hands in the city's underground seemed to pass through him at some point. He had done what no one thought possible. Merge crime with culture, violence with glamour. He wasn't just another gangster now. He was a brand. But success is a strange kind of poison. The more he drank, the more it consumed him. The parties grew wilder, the deals riskier, the nights longer. He was burning at both ends, living fast, trusting his charm to keep him safe. And for a while, it worked. But even stars eventually burn out. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew that. Maybe that's why he started looking toward the desert more seriously. The one place untouched, unspoiled, waiting to be conquered. Hollywood had given him everything he thought he wanted. Money, fame, respect, love. But now it all felt too small. The city that once felt limitless now seemed like a cage built from light. Out there, beyond the hills, there was a blank canvas waiting, an empire still unborn. As he drove through the California night, the road stretching endlessly ahead, he could already see it, a palace of glass and neon rising from the sand, a monument to everything he'd ever been. The stars above shimmered like casino lights. He pressed hard on the gas, the engine roaring beneath him. In the rearview mirror, Los Angeles flickered like a dying flame. Ahead, the desert waited, empty, silent, infinite. He didn't know it yet, but the next chapter of his story was already beginning. The Hollywood gangster was about to become the man who built a city from dust. And in that endless expanse of sand, his destiny and his destruction were waiting side by side, glowing under the same merciless sun. Chapter 7. The Move to Las Vegas, 1941 to 1945. The desert looked endless from behind the wheel, a sea of sand and heat shimmering beneath the merciless Nevada sun. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel drove with one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting on the open window, a cigarette burning slowly between his fingers. The road stretched out like a ribbon of glass, reflecting a future he could already feel pressing against the horizon. For most men, this place was nothing. Dust, silence, a graveyard for dreams. But to him, it was alive with possibility. The further he got from Los Angeles, the lighter he felt, as if he were shedding the weight of every deal, every threat, every lie. He wasn't running from Hollywood. He was running toward something bigger, something that would outlast him. Las Vegas was hardly a city in those days, just a dusty outpost clinging to the highway between Los Angeles and Salt Lake. A handful of saloons, motels, and neon signs flickering like dying stars. The Hoover Dam had brought workers, and the war had brought soldiers looking for escape, but it was still rough, still small, still wild. Gambling was legal, but the operations were crude, run by hustlers and dreamers who thought small. When Siegel first drove down Fremont Street, he saw through the cheap lights and empty lots. Where others saw sand, he saw potential. It wasn't just a town, it was a blank canvas. And he was the kind of man who needed to leave marks on the world. He checked into the El Rancho Vegas, one of the first resort-style hotels on the Strip, and watched the crowd that night from the bar. Men in cowboy hats, women in dresses that caught the light, the faint sound of dice rolling, laughter that didn't quite reach the eyes. There was money here, but not the kind he was used to. This was working-class money, soldiers' pay, travelers' winnings. He thought about the rich men and movie stars back in California, how they loved to gamble, how they longed for privacy. If he could bring them here, to this nowhere town, and make it feel like paradise, he could build something the world had never seen. He wasn't the first to think it, but he was the first to truly believe it. The idea had started with William Wilkerson, a Hollywood entrepreneur and founder of The Hollywood Reporter. Wilkerson had dreamed of creating a luxury hotel casino, something elegant, something refined, something that would bring class to gambling. But dreams require money, and that was something he was running out of. When Siegel heard about the project, he was intrigued. A resort in the desert, halfway between fantasy and madness. It sounded like him. He met with Wilkerson in Los Angeles, listened to his pitch, and smiled quietly. "You've got the dream," he said. "I've got the means." Back in New York, the syndicate had been looking for new investments. Gambling was the future. They all knew it. The end of Prohibition had dried up the liquor profits, but casinos promised something bigger, cleaner, more permanent. Las Vegas, with its legal gambling and minimal oversight, was a gold mine waiting to be mined. Meyer Lansky was cautious, as always, preferring steady profit to risky spectacle. But Siegel was different. He didn't want a casino. He wanted an empire. Convincing the syndicate to fund the project wasn't easy. The old bosses didn't trust the desert, didn't trust the distance, and didn't trust Siegel's flair for the dramatic. They saw it as a gamble on top of a gamble. But Benjamin was persuasive. He painted a picture they couldn't resist. Hollywood stars filling hotel suites, high rollers flying in from across the country, politicians and businessmen cutting deals over champagne. A place where the mob's money could become legitimate, wrapped in glamour and neon. "Vegas will make us respectable," he said, and for a moment, even the skeptics believed him. With their backing, he took control of Wilkerson's project and renamed it the Flamingo. It was a fitting name, flashy, exotic, and unforgettable. Virginia Hill, always at his side, loved it. "A bird that stands on one leg but still looks like it owns the world," she said. He laughed and kissed her, but behind his smile was calculation. The Flamingo would be his masterpiece, his monument. He didn't just want to build a casino. He wanted to create a world. Construction began in 1945, and from the start, it was chaos. The desert was unforgiving. Sandstorms tore through the work site. Water had to be trucked in, and temperatures soared high enough to melt the tar on the road. But the biggest problem wasn't nature. It was Siegel himself. He demanded perfection. Imported marble, custom chandeliers, pink flamingo motifs that matched the theme down to the napkins. Every corner of the project had to reflect his vision of luxury. Costs spiraled out of control. What started as a $1 million project soon ballooned to over $6 million, then higher. His partners back east grew nervous. Money was disappearing, invoices didn't match, and rumors spread that Siegel and Virginia were skimming off the top. In truth, much of the money went into his obsession with detail, gold-plated fixtures, imported carpets, and endless redesigns. He was trying to build something timeless, but the syndicate didn't care about art. They care about numbers. Every week, another message arrived from Lansky or Luciano, asking for explanations. Siegel sent back reassurances, promises that it would all pay off in the end. "Wait till you see it," he'd say. "This will make every other joint look like a dump." But time was running out. The war had ended, the soldiers were coming home, and the economy was shifting. The Flamingo needed to open, or the investors would revolt. Siegel pushed harder, yelling at contractors, firing workers, hiring new ones. His temper, once controlled by charm, began to slip. The men on the site learned to fear his arrival. He'd storm through the half-finished rooms in his silk suits, cursing the delays, smashing glass ashtrays against the wall. Yet when he calmed, he'd stand in the middle of the chaos and smile, as if he could already see the finished masterpiece in his mind. Someday, he'd tell Virginia, "People will come here from all over the world. This will be the center of everything." In Los Angeles, his presence had become erratic. He was still running his gambling operations, still entertaining movie stars, but his focus had shifted completely to the desert. He drove back and forth constantly, his car carving a groove into the highway between Beverly Hills and Las Vegas. At night, he'd sit outside the construction site, watching the skeletal frame of the hotel rise against the moonlight, dreaming of the crowds that would one day fill it. For all his volatility, there was something almost childlike in his belief. He wasn't just building for money anymore. He was building for legacy. But the desert had a way of humbling men. Delays mounted, materials vanished, suppliers demanded more money, and inspectors found violations. Each setback fueled his rage. He accused partners of betrayal, shouted at his workers, and threatened anyone who questioned him. Even Virginia began to worry. She had seen his temper before, but this was different, deeper, darker, desperate. The man who once commanded with charm was now a storm barely contained. By 1946, the Flamingo was bleeding money. The syndicate sent emissaries to investigate, men with quiet voices and colder eyes. They sat with him in the half-finished casino, counting the costs, calculating the losses, asking where it had all gone wrong. Siegel argued, pleaded, promised again that everything would change once the doors opened. "It's not a casino," he said. "It's a revolution." The men listened but left unconvinced. Word traveled back east. Patience was running out. Meanwhile, back in Los Angeles, federal authorities were circling. Siegel's name appeared in more and more investigations: tax evasion, racketeering, illegal gambling. The newspapers that once praised his charm now hinted at corruption. The glamorous Hollywood gangster was becoming a liability. Yet he refused to hide. He still appeared at parties, still smiled for cameras, still carried himself as if he were untouchable. But beneath the surface, paranoia was growing. He began carrying multiple guns, watching his mirrors, trusting fewer and fewer people. Virginia tried to calm him, but she was growing restless too. The money that flowed so easily before was now tangled in debts and accusations. Their relationship, already volatile, became a battlefield. They'd fight until dawn, then collapse into silence, bound together by something stronger than love and more destructive than hate. She wanted to believe in his dream, but even she could see it slipping away. Then came the moment he'd been waiting for. December 26th, 1946. The Flamingo was finally ready, or at least ready enough to open. The night was cold, the desert sky clear, and the casino glittered under its new neon sign. Inside, everything sparkled. The marble floors, the glass chandeliers, the roulette wheels that gleamed under the lights. Guests arrived from Los Angeles, stars and socialites eager to see what Siegel had built. He stood in the center of it all, smiling like a king surveying his kingdom. But as the night went on, the cracks showed. The air conditioning failed. The kitchen ran out of food. Half the rooms weren't finished, and the crowd was thinner than expected. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the new windows. By midnight, the laughter had faded, replaced by awkward silence. The Flamingo, his dream, was a disaster. When the final numbers came in, the losses were staggering. He didn't sleep that night. He walked through the empty casino, staring at the tables, the broken champagne glasses, the shadows stretching across the floor. Virginia found him there at dawn, sitting alone at the bar. "It's just one night," she said softly. "They'll come back." He looked up at her, eyes hollow. "They better," he murmured, "or I'm dead." In the following weeks, the casino closed temporarily for repairs, then reopened in early 1947. This time, things started to turn around. The crowds came back. The games ran smoothly. Money began to flow. Slowly, the Flamingo started to live up to its promise. But it was too late. Back east, the syndicate had already decided his fate. The money lost couldn't be forgiven, and the rumors of missing funds were too loud to ignore. The men who once admired him now saw him as reckless, untrustworthy, dangerous in all the wrong ways. He sensed it before anyone told him. The calls grew shorter, the meetings colder, the messages fewer. Lansky tried to protect him, arguing that the Flamingo would eventually pay off, but even he couldn't hold back the tide. Trust, once lost, never returned in their world. Benjamin had built his empire on vision and charm, but neither could save him now. Still, he refused to give up. He poured himself into the casino, greeting guests, fixing problems, trying to prove everyone wrong. For a brief moment, it looked like he might. The Flamingo was finally turning a profit, drawing crowds, becoming what he had always envisioned. But destiny doesn't forgive mistakes. As he stood outside one evening, watching the pink neon flicker against the desert sky, he couldn't help but feel proud. For all the chaos, all the blood, all the betrayals, he had done something no one else dared. He had turned sand into spectacle, nothing into everything. The city was still small, the dream still fragile, but he knew what it could become. Las Vegas would outlive them all. The wind swept across the desert, carrying dust and whispers. Somewhere far away, decisions were being made. Men he once called friends were planning how to end his story. But that night, standing under the glowing sign of the Flamingo, Benjamin Siegel smiled. The boy from Brooklyn had built a palace in the desert, and for a brief, fleeting moment, it was enough. The world would remember him, not just as a gangster, not just as a killer, but as the man who saw the future where no one else did. And even if it killed him, he had made it real. Chapter 8, The Flamingo Dream, 1945 to 1946. The sun was sinking behind the Nevada mountains, bleeding red across the endless sky, as Benjamin Bugsy Siegel stood in the open desert and imagined a city that didn't exist yet. The wind blew hot against his face, carrying the smell of dust and distance. Around him were nothing but tumbleweeds, scattered rocks, and the faint hum of the highway somewhere beyond the horizon. He squinted into the distance and saw lights in his mind, bright pink, gold, and white, flashing against the night like promises. The world would call it madness. He called it vision. To him, Las Vegas wasn't a patch of sand. It was the future. And the Flamingo, the luxury resort he planned to build there, would be its beating heart. He was standing on a foundation of nothing, yet he believed in it, as if it were destiny. The timing was perfect, or so he thought. The war had ended, soldiers were coming home, and America was ready to live again, to spend, to forget the years of rationing and death. He wanted to give them paradise, a place where money, glamour, and sin could live together without apology. A place where the rules didn't matter. For a man who had spent his life rewriting them, that was the only dream worth chasing. The construction site didn't look like much at first. A few half-built walls, piles of steel, a small office where papers and blueprints fought the wind. But in Benjamin's mind, he could already hear the music, smell the perfume, see the women in gowns walking through marble halls. He wanted perfection. He wanted beauty. He wanted something that would make even Hollywood seem small. "It's not just a casino," he said to one of his men, tapping the plans on the table. "It's a revolution." The man nodded, not really understanding. Nobody understood it yet. Not even Virginia Hill, the woman who followed him from Los Angeles to the desert, half out of love, half out of fear. The Flamingo was supposed to be simple at first, an elegant hotel with a casino, a pool, and a few restaurants. William Wilkerson's original plan had been practical, profitable, restrained. But Siegel didn't do restrained. The moment he took over, everything changed. He added gardens, luxury suites, imported furniture, custom chandeliers, silk drapes, fountains. He hired architects from Beverly Hills, decorators from Europe, chefs from New York. Each addition cost more than the last. What began as a $1 million project quickly became 3, then 4, then 6. Every week, a new bill arrived, and every week, Siegel found a way to justify it. "You can't sell paradise on a budget," he told Virginia, half smiling, half daring the world to argue. But paradise had a price, and the people paying it were growing restless. Back in New York, the syndicate bosses were watching the numbers climb with disbelief. Meyer Lansky, always cautious, tried to reason with him, sending letters and warnings through intermediaries. "Keep it tight, Benny," he wrote. "We're investors, not dreamers." But Siegel wasn't listening. He believed the Flamingo would make them all richer than anything they'd ever touched. To him, it wasn't about cost, it was about legacy. "When they see it," he said, "they'll understand." He spent his days on the construction site, sweating in the desert sun, barking orders at foremen, threatening suppliers, and charming anyone who dared question him. At night, he'd drive back to Los Angeles, slipping into tuxedos and dining with producers, actors, and politicians. He was living in two worlds, the dust and the spotlight, and both were starting to pull him apart. Virginia watched him change, the charm fading into tension, the laughter replaced by silence. He slept less, drank more, and his temper became unpredictable. When he wasn't fighting with contractors, he was arguing with her. Their love, once intoxicating, had turned into a storm. She wanted him to slow down, to enjoy what they had. But he couldn't. He wasn't built for peace. Every quiet moment felt like failure. "You don't understand," he told her one night, pacing their hotel suite in Las Vegas. "This isn't just business. This is history. People will remember my name because of this." She looked at him for a long moment, her voice calm and tired. "They already remember your name," she said softly. He turned to her, eyes sharp, restless. "Not like this," he whispered. The spending grew wild. He ordered custom pink tiles from Italy, drapes from France, and concrete imported from California because he didn't trust local suppliers. He had chandeliers designed in New York and flown in on private planes. Every detail mattered to him, and every delay drove him insane. Workers quit, replaced by others who quickly learned to fear the man in the tailored suits. If the work wasn't done right, he'd explode, throwing blueprints across the room, shouting until his voice broke. Then, just as suddenly, he'd smile, clap a man on the back, and say, "Forget it, kid. Just fix it." It was chaos and charisma in equal measure. The project was bleeding money, but Siegel kept pushing forward. He borrowed, gambled, and called in favors. He made promises to men who didn't forgive easily. The mob bosses were growing impatient. Lansky was protecting him as best he could, vouching for his intentions, calming the rumors of embezzlement. But others, Luciano, Costello, Buckelter, weren't as forgiving. They didn't care about his dream. They wanted their money back. Still, Siegel pressed on, convinced that once the doors opened, the Flamingo would pay for everything. By mid-1946, the pressure was unbearable. The desert heat mixed with paranoia. The money was vanishing faster than it came in, and every phone call felt like a threat. Virginia tried to convince him to take a break, to step away before it broke him, but he refused. "If I walk away now, they'll never let me live," he said. "If I finish it, they can't touch me." He believed that. He believed in the illusion of safety that success could buy. It was the same illusion he'd sold to others his entire life. As the opening date approached, problems piled up. The plumbing wasn't finished. The air conditioning failed. The glass windows cracked from the desert heat. The kitchen was incomplete, the rooms unfurnished, the parking lot still dirt. But he didn't care. He'd set the date, December 26th, 1946, and nothing was going to stop it. "It's ready enough," he told his staff. "They'll come for the name, not the paint." The night arrived, cold and cloudless, the desert stars sharp as knives. Limousines rolled up one after another, headlights slicing through the dark. Inside the Flamingo, the lights glowed pink and gold, reflecting off marble floors and mirrored walls. Guests poured in, Hollywood stars, mob associates, investors, curious travelers. The air buzzed with champagne and anticipation. Siegel moved through the crowd like a king, shaking hands, smiling, every gesture rehearsed. He wore a white suit, his tie perfectly knotted, his eyes bright with pride and exhaustion. For a few hours, it worked. The Flamingo shimmered with life. The dice rolled, the music played, the bar overflowed. For a moment, it seemed like he had pulled it off. Then the illusion cracked. The air conditioning failed again, the electricity flickered, and the kitchen couldn't keep up with the demand. Guests complained about the unfinished rooms, about dust on the carpets, about the cold draft coming through the walls. The smiles began to fade, replaced by whispers. People started leaving early, their laughter echoing down the hallway like ghosts. By midnight, the casino floor was half empty. Siegel stood at the bar, watching it all unravel, his knuckles white against the glass he was holding. "It's fine," he muttered to no one in particular. "It's just the first night." But it wasn't fine. The newspapers mocked him the next morning, calling the Flamingo Siegel's folly a half-baked dream in the middle of nowhere. The investors were furious. The syndicate demanded answers. Back east, men were having meetings, quiet, final meetings, about whether Benjamin Siegel was more trouble than he was worth. Lansky begged for more time. "Give him a chance," he said. "The place will turn around." But faith has limits, even among friends. The Flamingo closed soon after, shutting down for repairs and upgrades. Siegel was humiliated, but he refused to show it. He threw himself back into work, overseeing every detail, every screw, every piece of furniture. He demanded perfection with the desperation of a man who knew he was running out of time. Virginia stayed by his side, though the cracks between them had widened. She could feel the danger coming, sense it in the silence that followed every phone call. But he brushed it off, telling her not to worry. "When this place starts making money," he said, "they'll forget everything." In January, the Flamingo reopened. Slowly, things began to change. The crowds returned, the games ran smoothly, and the profits started to climb. Against all odds, Siegel's vision was finally working. The same people who mocked him were now lining up to see the desert's new jewel. The casino glittered under the neon glow, the bars filled with laughter, and the hotel rooms, now fully finished, overflowed with guests. It was everything he had promised, everything he had imagined on that first night in the desert. But redemption had come too late. The damage had already been done. The bosses back east didn't care about future success. They cared about past betrayal. By spring of 1947, the Flamingo was profitable, but Siegel was a dead man walking. The syndicate had made up its mind. The missing money, millions that could never be accounted for, was reason enough. Some said he had stolen it. Others said Virginia had. The truth didn't matter anymore. In their world, doubt was a death sentence. Meyer tried one last time to save him, pleading with the others, but his voice couldn't outweigh their anger. "He's family," Lansky said quietly. "He built it for all of us." The reply came cold, "And he built it with our money." Benjamin didn't know the details, but he could feel the shift. The phone calls grew shorter, the laughter forced. Even Virginia seemed distant. He started spending more time at the Flamingo, greeting guests, playing the host, pretending everything was fine. But at night, when the casino went quiet, he'd sit by the window and stare into the desert. The lights of Las Vegas were spreading slowly, like veins of fire against the sand. He had built the spark that would ignite the city, but deep down, he knew he wouldn't live to see it burn. One evening, he walked through the casino alone, his footsteps echoing against the marble. The dealers were counting chips, the janitors sweeping, the last of the guests stumbling upstairs. He paused by the roulette table, running his fingers along the smooth wood. "It's perfect," he whispered. Maybe he was talking about the table. Maybe about the dream. Maybe about the inevitability of what was coming. Then he smiled, the same smile that had carried him through every deal, every fight, every gamble of his life. He lit a cigarette and walked out into the desert air. The neon lights of the Flamingo flickered behind him, painting the night pink. He had done it. Against every warning, every threat, every impossible odd, he had built what he saw in his mind that first day. Luxury in the middle of nothing, beauty born from dust. The Flamingo wasn't just a building. It was a declaration, and though he didn't know it yet, it was also his farewell. In a few months, he would pay for the dream with his life. But in that moment, standing under the electric glow, Benjamin Siegel felt invincible again. The boy from Brooklyn, the gangster from New York, the visionary of the desert. He had beaten the odds one last time. For a brief and shining moment, the Flamingo was his, and the desert belonged to him. Chapter 9. The Empire of Sand, 1946. The desert at night had a strange kind of silence, thick, electric, like the world was holding its breath. Out there, beneath the neon glow of the Flamingo's pink lights, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel stood on the balcony of his unfinished dream, staring into the horizon. The sand stretched out endlessly, black under the moon, swallowing the sound of the wind. The lights of Las Vegas flickered in the distance, small and fragile, like a candle trying to survive a storm. Behind him, through the glass doors, music drifted faintly from the casino floor, laughter, dice rolling, the clink of glasses. It was everything he had wanted, and yet, something about it felt hollow. Success was so close he could almost touch it, but so was the end. And, in his world, the two often came together. Inside, the Flamingo gleamed. Marble floors, gold trim, mirrored walls reflecting every movement. Guests in tuxedos and gowns moved through the lobby, sipping cocktails, admiring the chandeliers he had personally ordered from New York. On the surface, it looked like triumph, a palace of light rising from the dust. But behind the shine, cracks were spreading. The money had stopped flowing. The syndicate's patience had worn thin. And Benjamin, the man who had turned an empty desert into a monument of luxury, was about to find out that even dreams could bleed. The reopening of the Flamingo in early 1947 had been better than the disastrous first launch, but it was still far from the empire he promised. Business picked up slowly, profits trickled in, but the losses from construction hung over everything like a curse. The mob's money, their millions, was still missing, and no one believed his explanations anymore. In Las Vegas, Siegel smiled, charmed investors, and played the role of host. But in New York, meetings were being held. Quiet, final meetings. The kind that decided who lived and who didn't. He could feel it in the phone calls, the change in tone, the pauses that lasted too long. Even Meyer Lansky's voice, usually steady, had grown colder. "You need to fix this, Benny," he told him one night over the crackling line. "You got to show them it works." Siegel laughed softly, as if he still believed he could. "I built this city, Meyer," he said. "They won't kill the man who made it." But there was a weariness in his voice, a shadow under the bravado. He knew better. In their world, nobody was too valuable to die. He had always relied on charm to get him through. But charm only worked when people wanted to believe. Now, every smile looked like a lie, every promise like a delay. The Flamingo's books were a mess. Contracts forged, numbers changed, expenses that didn't exist. The truth was simple. The project had grown beyond control. Some of the missing money had gone into the endless redesigns, some into stolen materials, some into the pockets of men who never showed up again. But the syndicate didn't care about details. They saw only betrayal. The investors began sending men to watch him. They stood by the bar, at the corners of the gaming floor, at the entrance to the hotel, quiet, polite, but always there. He'd catch their reflections in the mirrors, watching him without blinking. It was a different kind of pressure now, not the quick danger of a street fight, but the slow suffocation of inevitability. Every night, he'd drive home through the desert, headlights slicing the darkness, his hand never far from the pistol in his coat. Virginia Hill was growing restless too. Their relationship had always burned hot, but now it was burning out. She was tired of the shouting, the paranoia, the endless demands for money. Some nights she'd disappear, flying to Europe or Los Angeles, staying gone for weeks. When she came back, she'd bring news from New York, rumors, whispers. "They're talking about you," she told him once, her voice trembling slightly. "They think you took it." He turned, his eyes hard. "Do you think I did?" he asked. She hesitated, and that silence was all it took. He threw his glass against the wall, the shards scattering across the marble. Then he turned away, his voice suddenly calm. "They'll have to kill me to take this from me," he said. He believed in the Flamingo the way a preacher believes in salvation. Even as everything crumbled, he saw only the dream. Every morning, he walked the casino floor, adjusting the lights, greeting guests, correcting staff with the eye of a perfectionist. He wanted the place to run flawlessly, to prove to everyone, especially the men back east, that he was right, that this desert could become the next empire. And slowly it began to work. The profits grew, the crowds returned. The Flamingo started making money. But in the world of organized crime, success that comes too late is no success at all. The syndicate's decision had already been made. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about control. Siegel had embarrassed them. He had gone rogue, spent their fortune like it was his own, ignored their warnings. The fact that the Flamingo was finally profitable didn't erase that. To them, it was proof of his arrogance. He had gambled with their empire and expected forgiveness. And forgiveness was a currency they never dealt in. Still, Lansky tried to save him. He called meeting after meeting, pleading with the bosses, reminding them of Siegel's loyalty, his history, his friendship. He made mistakes, sure, he said, but the Flamingo's working now. It'll pay us back. The reply came quiet and cold. He made us look weak. There's no coming back from that. In their world, image was power, and Siegel's defiance had made them look foolish. The decision was sealed with silence. Meanwhile, Siegel went on pretending nothing was wrong. He hosted parties, laughed with guests, posed for photographs, and charmed reporters. On the surface, he was still the glamorous gangster, the man who brought Hollywood to the desert. But those closest to him saw the cracks. He barely slept, paced at night, stared out the window for hours. Sometimes he talked to himself, muttering numbers, dates, names. Virginia called it madness. He called it strategy. But even he was starting to sense that the empire he built on sand was beginning to sink. The Flamingo had become a symbol of ambition, of excess, of everything he was. And in that symbol lay the tragedy. It was never just a business to him. It was his redemption. He had spent his life surrounded by death, betrayal, and fear. The Flamingo was supposed to be his way out, his proof that he was more than a killer. But the past doesn't let go so easily. You can dress it in marble and silk, but underneath, it's still blood and violence. The desert wind carried whispers. Everyone in Las Vegas knew something was coming. The waiters, the dealers, the pit bosses, they all felt it. Siegel walked through the casino like a ghost, smiling, but distant, as if he already knew what fate was waiting in the dark. Some nights he'd drive alone down the empty highway, the lights of the city fading behind him, the engine roaring under the stars. It was the only place he could think, the only place the noise stopped. In one of those drives, he stopped by the side of the road, stepped out, and stood beneath the vast sky. The stars burned bright above him, indifferent, eternal. He looked back toward the faint glow of the Flamingo and whispered to himself, "They'll see. They'll all see." Maybe he believed it. Maybe he didn't. But for that brief moment, he looked like a man standing at the edge of both his masterpiece and his grave. The days grew quieter. Virginia began spending more time away, traveling to Europe, visiting Switzerland, moving money. Some said she was transferring the syndicate's funds, others that she was protecting Siegel's. Nobody knew for sure, but her absence left him alone with the ghosts of his choices. The Flamingo was making money now, but every dollar felt like an echo of something already lost. He'd walk through the lobby, hearing the laughter of guests who had no idea their host was living on borrowed time. He'd nod politely, smile faintly, and keep moving. In May of 1947, he took a trip back to Los Angeles, staying at Virginia's Beverly Hills home on Linden Drive. He told friends he needed a break, that he wanted to rest, maybe plan his next project. But everyone knew what it really was: a retreat, a pause before whatever was coming. The syndicate had stopped returning his calls. Lansky hadn't written in weeks. Even his closest men were avoiding eye contact. The silence around him had become unbearable. He spent his last weeks in Los Angeles restless and nostalgic, driving through the city that once made him powerful. He'd go to restaurants where he used to hold court, see familiar faces who now looked away. The man who had once ruled Hollywood's underworld was now a ghost haunting his own legend. But he still carried himself with pride. He still wore the best suits, still tipped the waiters like a king. The dreamer in him refused to die, even as the world around him prepared to kill the man. One evening, as the sun set over the Pacific, he sat alone on Virginia's balcony, staring out at the skyline. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of orange trees. He poured himself a drink, lit a cigarette, and whispered, "They'll come for me soon." He said it without fear, almost with resignation. In his mind, maybe he thought he could still talk his way out of it, like he always had. Maybe he thought the Flamingo's success would save him. Or maybe he had finally accepted that in the empire he built, every king eventually falls to his own crown. The calls from the desert kept coming. Updates, numbers, reports, but he barely listened. The Flamingo was alive, yes, but belonged to others now. His dream had taken on a life of its own, one that didn't need him anymore. He had built something that would outlive him, and that thought brought a strange kind of peace. He had always wanted immortality. Maybe this was how men like him earned it. Not through survival, but through legend. As he sat in the quiet of that house, the shadows growing long across the walls, the city humming below, Benjamin Siegel looked every bit the man he had always wanted to be, calm, elegant, untouchable. But the empire he had built from sand was already shifting beneath him. Somewhere far away, men he once called brothers were finalizing his fate. The votes were in, the decision unanimous. The dreamer had become a liability. The empire would live on, but its architect would not. In a few days, he would stand in that same room, by that same window, a cigarette in his hand, the glow of the Flamingo still fresh in his memory. He would hear the sound of breaking glass, feel the air split by a single bullet, and fall into the silence he had spent his life outrunning. But on this night, as the wind rustled through the palms and the stars blinked above, he was still alive, still the man who believed he could turn dust into gold. The empire of sand stood behind him, fragile and glorious, waiting for history to claim it. And somewhere deep inside, he must have known that dreams built on fire always end in smoke. Chapter 10. The Final Betrayal, 1947. The night of June 20th, 1947, was warm in Beverly Hills, the kind of summer night that felt calm, almost too calm. The air was thick with the smell of citrus and jasmine, and the lights of Los Angeles glowed softly in the distance, a golden haze against the dark sky. Inside a Spanish-style house on North Linden Drive, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel was sitting in an armchair by the window, flipping through the pages of the Los Angeles Times. A glass of scotch rested on the table beside him, half empty, catching the reflection of the lamplight. The house was quiet, too quiet for a man whose life had been lived in noise. Somewhere in the back room, a radio hummed faintly, the sound of big band music drifting through the air like a ghost from a different time. He had spent the evening in good spirits, or at least pretending to be. Friends had come by for drinks, laughter echoing through the house, the kind of forced joy that covers the weight of dread. Virginia Hill wasn't there. She had left for Europe weeks earlier, claiming it was business, though both of them knew it was more than that. Some said she was protecting money. Others said she was protecting herself. Either way, the woman who had once matched his fire was gone, and he was left alone with the smoke of everything he'd built. Outside, the street was silent. Palm trees stood like watchmen in the moonlight, their shadows stretching long across the pavement. The city was asleep, but in the underworld, there were no dreams, only debts. Somewhere far away, in New York and Las Vegas, the phone lines had already gone quiet. The decision had been made. Bugsy Siegel, the visionary, the gambler, the man who had turned desert dust into neon, was marked for death. He didn't know the exact moment, but he must have sensed it. For weeks, his nerve had been on edge, his paranoia growing heavier. He checked his mirrors when he drove, carried 2 guns wherever he went, and kept the lights low when he was home. But the strange thing was, he wasn't running. He was tired of running. Maybe he thought his legend could protect him, that the Flamingo's success had bought him a reprieve. Or maybe he just didn't care anymore. For a man who had lived his entire life on borrowed time, the thought of the end wasn't terrifying. It was inevitable. He glanced up from his paper and looked out the window. The street lamp outside flickered once, twice, then steadied. He smiled faintly, as if amused by the omen. The Flamingo was doing well now, finally turning a profit, finally living up to the promise he'd made to the syndicate. It was ironic, almost poetic, that just as his creation began to thrive, his own time was running out. He had gambled with the mob's money and lost their trust, and in their world, forgiveness didn't exist. He reached for his glass, swirling the amber liquid inside. The house felt too still, the kind of stillness that doesn't belong in life, but in waiting. He took a slow sip, set the drink down, and turned the page of his newspaper. Outside, a car slowed as it passed the house, headlights sweeping briefly across the window before fading into the distance. Somewhere a dog barked once, then stopped. Across the country, Meyer Lansky sat in a dark office, staring at the phone on his desk. He had fought for Benny, argued for him, pleaded with the others. He had told them the Flamingo would recover, that Siegel was still valuable, still loyal. But the others had stopped listening. To them, it was no longer about business. It was about respect. Bugsy had made them look weak, like fools funding a dreamer's vanity project. The millions lost couldn't be explained away. It's already decided. One of them had told Lansky. You can't save him now. Meyer had nodded quietly, his face unreadable. He didn't call Benny. What could he have said? There are some warnings that don't change anything. Back in Beverly Hills, Siegel folded the paper and leaned back in his chair. He felt calm, unnaturally so. The tension that had lived in him for months seemed to dissolve for a moment. Maybe he thought the worst was over. Maybe he believed he had finally convinced them that the future he'd built in the desert would make them all rich. Or maybe, deep down, he knew that there were some debts even success couldn't erase. At around 10:45 that night, two men sat parked in a black Buick across the street. They'd been there for over an hour, their engine off, windows cracked, smoke drifting from their cigarettes. One of them checked his watch, then glanced at the house. Through the window, they could see him, calm, relaxed, his profile outlined by the soft yellow glow of the lamp beside him. The newspaper was open again in his lap. The man in the passenger seat adjusted his coat, pulled something from under the seat, a rifle, a .30 caliber M1 carbine fitted with a telescopic sight. He leaned forward, resting the barrel on the edge of the window. Inside, Siegel turned another page. The air felt different now, heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath. He didn't look up. He couldn't have known the car across the street or the shadow behind the glass. He might have sensed it, though, some faint vibration in the air, a feeling that something unseen was moving toward him. He reached for his drink again. The first shot shattered the window. The second hit before the sound of the glass had even faded. Then came 5 more in quick succession, tearing through the quiet, echoing off the stucco walls. The first bullet struck him in the cheek, the second just below his right eye. The rest tore into the wall, the sofa, the window frame. He was dead before the glass hit the floor. The newspaper slipped from his hands, fluttering onto the carpet. The drink spilled, the scotch pooling beside his shoe. The lamp on the table flickered once and went out. Outside, the car started its engine and drove away slowly, the sound fading into the night as if nothing had happened. For a few seconds, the house was silent again. Then a neighbor, hearing the crash of glass, came running. By the time the police arrived, Siegel was slumped sideways in the chair, his body still, his face eerily peaceful. The newspaper lay open across his legs, a headline about world affairs blurred by a few drops of his blood. News of the killing spread fast, faster than any other murder in mob history. The man who had once seemed untouchable, who had turned a barren desert into a playground of light, was gone in an instant. The newspapers the next morning didn't hold back. Bugsy Siegel slain in Beverly Hills. The photos were everywhere, his body in the chair, the shattered window, the spilled drink. The glamorous gangster, the dreamer, reduced to a still image frozen in time. In Las Vegas, the reaction was eerily efficient. That same night, just hours after the shots were fired, 3 men walked into the Flamingo and announced that the property was now under new management. No hesitation, no emotion, just business. The empire had outlived its creator. The casino kept running as if nothing had happened. Guests gambled, the band played, the lights stayed on. By dawn, the Flamingo was buzzing with life again. The dream had survived, but the dreamer had not. Meyer Lansky received the news in silence. He didn't cry, didn't curse. He simply sat there, staring at the phone that had finally rung. "It's done," the voice said. He hung up slowly, then poured himself a drink, his hands trembling slightly. He had known this was coming, but knowing didn't make it easier. Bugsy had been his closest friend, his partner since the streets of Brooklyn. He had watched him rise, fall, and rise again. He had tried to save him, but in their world, friendship only went so far. Business came first. Virginia Hill heard about it days later, in Switzerland. She didn't answer the phone at first. When the voice on the other end finally told her, she went silent. Some said she screamed. Others said she just sat there, staring at the wall. She returned to the United States months later, quieter, colder, a woman who had outlived her legend. She never talked about that night. Not to reporters, not to friends. Whatever she knew about who gave the order, she took to her grave. The police investigation went nowhere. No witnesses, no suspects, no arrests. Everyone had theories. Some blamed the syndicate. Others thought Virginia had betrayed him. There were whispers that the gunman had come from Las Vegas, sent by the men who owned the Flamingo now. But in truth, it didn't matter. The rules of that world were clear. When the bosses decided, the executioners followed. There was no need for trials or explanations. The desert dreamer had made his last bet, and the house had finally collected. In the days that followed, the Flamingo's profits soared. Crowds came to see it, drawn by the name, the story, the blood on the legend. The man who had built it had become part of its mythology, a ghost haunting the neon lights. The very thing that destroyed him had immortalized him. He had wanted to build something that would outlive him. And he had, just not in the way he imagined. At his funeral in Los Angeles, only a few dozen people attended. The reporters outnumbered the mourners. There were no speeches, no tears, just silence and the sound of cameras clicking. Meyer didn't come. Neither did Virginia. The coffin was simple, the ceremony brief. As the dirt hit the wood, one of the few remaining friends who dared show up whispered, "You were right, Benny. They'll never forget you." They didn't. Las Vegas grew, mile by mile, casino by casino, until the city he dreamed became real. The Flamingo stood as its crown jewel, its pink lights glowing like a memorial. In the years that followed, others built on his foundation, bigger, richer, louder. But none of them carried what he did. That strange mix of violence and vision, of danger and beauty. He wasn't just another mobster. He was a man who saw the future in the dust. In the decades since, his name became legend. Books, films, and documentaries turned him into myth. The handsome gangster who built the city of sin, the visionary cut down by the very empire he created. To the world, he was the man who brought the mob to Hollywood and glamour to crime. To those who knew him, he was something else, brilliant, reckless, impossible to control, doomed from the start. And maybe that's what made him unforgettable. He lived like a flame, burning too bright, too fast, lighting everything around him before consuming himself. In the end, the desert didn't kill him. The dream did. The same vision that lifted him out of Brooklyn's alleys, that made him a king among killers, also sealed his fate. He wanted to create something beautiful in a world built on violence. And beauty, in that world, was always fatal. If you stand in front of the Flamingo today, you can still feel him there. The wind off the desert carries the echo of dice rolling, the laughter of ghosts, the faint whisper of ambition that refuses to die. Under the neon lights that never go out, you can almost see his shadow walking through the lobby, a cigarette glowing in the dark, that familiar grin still playing on his lips. The man who built Las Vegas from sand and sin may be gone, but his empire of dreams, greed, and light, still burns beneath the desert sky. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel wanted immortality, and in the end, he got it. Not in life, but in legend. Chapter 11. The Fallout, 1947 to 1949. The desert wind carried no answers, only dust. It swept across the streets of Las Vegas, rattling the new neon signs that flickered against the night, painting the sand in shades of pink and gold. The Flamingo's lights still burned bright, their hum rising softly into the warm air like a hymn for the dead. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel had been gone for weeks, but his presence lingered everywhere, in the marble halls he had built, in the way the dealers shuffled their cards, in the whispers that filled the casino corners when the music faded. His dream hadn't died with him. It had just changed hands. The news of his murder had hit the country like a thunderclap. The papers couldn't get enough of it. Gangster slain in Beverly Hills. The headlines screamed, printed beside photographs of shattered glass and blood-stained newspapers. The glamorous mobster, the Hollywood outlaw, the man who built a city in the sand, gone in 7 bullets. To the public, it was a mystery. To those who knew the business, it was just another balance being settled. The syndicate didn't issue warnings. It wrote endings. In Las Vegas, there was no mourning. Within 24 hours of his death, new men had taken control of the Flamingo. They moved through the casino with quiet efficiency, checking books, counting profits, replacing staff. The transition was smooth, almost surgical. The bosses back east wanted no chaos, no questions. The casino had to run, the money had to flow, and the legend of Bugsy Siegel had to become part of the decor. The empire he built now belonged to the man who had watched him fall. The first few months after his death were strange. Guests still came, drawn by morbid curiosity as much as luxury. They'd walk through the casino, ordering drinks and asking questions, glancing around like tourists visiting a shrine. Dealers whispered that the hotel was haunted, that sometimes late at night the chandeliers would sway when there was no wind, or that you could see a shadow pacing near the windows where he once stood. The management didn't discourage the rumors. It was good for business. The Flamingo had become more than a casino. It was a story, and stories always drew a crowd. Meyer Lansky visited Las Vegas quietly in the months that followed, not as a mourner, but as a manager. He walked the floors, reviewed the numbers, and saw what Benny had seen years earlier. The city wasn't a gamble, it was a gold mine. The profits were real now, steady and growing. Every table, every room, every drink was a tribute to a vision that had once been called madness. Lansky didn't talk about Siegel much, not publicly, but he carried the weight of it privately. He knew Benny had been reckless, maybe even arrogant, but he also knew the truth. Without Siegel, none of it would have existed. The Flamingo had cost millions, yes, but it had also created the blueprint for everything that would come after. Still, in the world they lived in, sentiment was a luxury. Lansky didn't have the power to change what had happened, only to make sure it meant something. So he did what he did best. He turned the tragedy into profit. Under new management, the Flamingo expanded. The hotel filled its rooms, the bar never closed, and the casino floor buzzed with life. The very thing that had destroyed Siegel now became his legacy. It was cruel, but it was fitting. He had built an empire that could only live without him. Virginia Hill returned to the United States that winter, stepping off the plane in New York with her sunglasses on and her mouth shut. The reporters swarmed her like flies, shouting questions, flashing cameras. "Did you know about the hit, Miss Hill? Were you involved? Did you steal the money?" She said nothing. Her silence became a shield, and in that silence, the rumors multiplied. Some said she had stolen millions of the syndicate's money and fled to Europe before the murder. Others claimed she had unknowingly triggered the hit by talking too freely. The truth was murky, and maybe she preferred it that way. Ambiguity was safer than explanation. She eventually moved to Chicago, then back to Europe. Her name faded from the headlines, though never from the whispers. She lived well, but not happily. People who saw her in those years said she carried a haunted look, as if every sound reminded her of shattering glass. Once, a journalist asked her if she ever thought about Siegel. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides too much, and said, "He was the only man who ever scared me, and the only one who ever loved me." Then she walked away. The police investigation into Siegel's murder went nowhere, just as everyone expected. The Beverly Hills detectives questioned neighbors, friends, even Virginia, but they knew the truth before they started. No one would talk, and no one who mattered wanted it solved. The case was closed quietly, filed away like a forgotten promise. It became one of those stories everyone knew the ending to, but pretended was still a mystery. In Las Vegas, however, his name refused to fade. The gamblers still spoke of him in hushed tones, half with fear, half with awe. That was Bugsy's table, they'd say. He used to stand right there. For years, the staff refused to remove his favorite chair from the casino bar. It became an unofficial memorial, empty but never forgotten. Even the new owners, for all their power and distance, couldn't erase him completely. The Flamingo might have been theirs on paper, but in spirit, it still belonged to the man who dreamed it into being. The world outside moved on quickly. The late 40s brought prosperity, and Las Vegas became America's new playground. Soldiers returning from war, businessmen seeking escape, movie stars looking for danger. They all came. The highways filled, the hotels multiplied, and what had once been a dusty outpost became a glowing mirage of money and sin. The Flamingo was the beginning, but it wasn't the end. Soon, new names appeared in bright lights. The Sahara, the Sands, the Desert Inn. Every new casino followed the same pattern, the same philosophy Siegel had created. Luxury wrapped around vice, sin dressed as sophistication. The formula worked too well to die with him. Each time a new hotel opened, someone would mention his name. This is what Bugsy wanted, they'd say. He saw it first. And he had. In every roulette wheel, in every neon sign that cut through the darkness, his fingerprints lingered. He had imagined a city that would never sleep, a place where morality was suspended between whiskey and wealth. And now, that city was real. The irony was bitter. The mob had killed the man who invented their biggest empire. Meyer Lansky made sure the Flamingo thrived. He brought in accountants, expanded the staff, installed managers who understood discipline, not dreams. Within a year, it became one of the most profitable casinos in America. He rarely spoke of Siegel, but when he did, his tone was quiet, almost reverent. Benny was a visionary, he once told an associate. He just forgot that vision doesn't pay the bills. It was both an epitaph and a lesson. In their business, genius didn't guarantee survival. The rest of the underworld learned from Siegel's fate. They built smarter, quieter, keeping the glamour, but stripping away the ego. Las Vegas became the syndicate's new frontier, a clean front for dirty money. The mob bosses who had once dismissed the desert now sent their men to buy land, build casinos, and turn gambling into an institution. What began as Siegel's folly became their fortune. But beyond the profits and the glitter, there was something else, something intangible. The story of Bugsy Siegel became part of Las Vegas's mythology, woven into the city's DNA. His ghost lingered in every photograph, every tale told over a glass of whiskey, every whispered deal made in the backroom. He had become an idea, a warning, a symbol. The man who dreamed too big and died for it. By 1949, the Flamingo was thriving, and Las Vegas had doubled in size. The city he had once walked through as a dreamer now pulsed with life, a heartbeat of neon and sin that could be seen from miles away. Tourists arrived by the thousands, drawn by the promise of fortune and freedom. The mob counted its cash, the hotels kept their secrets, and the desert, for the first time, felt alive. But the cost of that life was written in blood. Every casino, every light, every card shuffled under those chandeliers carried a trace of Siegel's shadow. The men who had ordered his death never spoke of it again. They didn't have to. The city itself was his memorial. The Flamingo stood tall, glowing against the night, proof that sometimes even betrayal can't kill a dream completely. Virginia Hill would later say, in one of her final interviews, that Siegel had known what was coming. He used to say, she recalled, that if he ever died, he'd die looking good. And he did. The photos of his death, cruel, haunting, cinematic, only added to his legend. He looked like a man caught between victory and defeat, frozen at the exact point where dreams turned to memory. Years later, when Hollywood began making movies about his life, they painted him as a romantic antihero, a tragic visionary who dared to dream too far ahead of his time. It wasn't all wrong. Bugsy Siegel was many things: killer, dreamer, showman, criminal. But above all, he was human. Flawed, driven, hungry for more than the world could give him. He wanted beauty in a business built on blood, and in the end, that contradiction destroyed him. By the time the 50s began, his name had become inseparable from Las Vegas itself. Every flicker of neon, every roll of dice, every song echoing from a casino lounge carried his ghost. The empire of sand had become real, and it was exactly what he had seen that first night when he stood under the desert stars. The city had grown into his vision, but it had done so over his grave. When the lights of the Flamingo blaze each night, they still burn with a trace of something deeper than electricity. They burn with memory, with ambition, betrayal, and the strange poetry of a man who built paradise and died for it. And if you stand there, just long enough, watching the lights shimmer against the darkness, you might hear him too. A faint whisper carried by the desert wind. The same words he spoke to Virginia long ago, when the dream was still alive. Someday, he told her, this would be the center of the world. And in the end, he was right. The world came, and it never left. Chapter 12. The Ghost of the Flamingo, 1950 to 1955. By the start of the new decade, Las Vegas had become something unrecognizable. The once quiet stretch of desert that Benjamin Bugsy Siegel had seen as a mirage was now glowing every night like a city pulled straight out of a dream. Neon lights painted the sand in color. Music poured from open casino doors, and crowds filled the streets where only silence used to live. The Flamingo, the monument to Siegel's vision and his undoing, stood at the center of it all, alive, thriving, and untouchable. But even in its success, there was an echo of him everywhere. Every light that flickered, every glass that clinked, every laugh that broke through the night seemed to carry his ghost. The man was gone, but the dream was breathing louder than ever. Inside the Flamingo, the glamour had reached new heights. The marble floors that once caught blood and dust now gleamed under chandeliers that reflected 1,000 tiny sparks. Showgirls danced under the hot glow of spotlights. Crooners filled the lounge with smooth songs about love and luck, and money changed hands faster than anyone could count. What had once been Siegel's burden was now everyone's prize. His casino had become the crown jewel of Las Vegas, a place where power, greed, and pleasure melted together. The mob bosses who had ordered his death now toasted each other in his lobby, their laughter rising above the hum of slot machines. They didn't speak his name anymore, but they didn't have to. The city itself whispered it for them. Meyer Lansky visited often in those years, though he kept his presence quiet. He would stand by the bar late at night, a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking around at the kingdom that had once been Benny's obsession. To most, it was just a business, a cash machine with velvet curtains. But to Lansky, it was something else, a living contradiction. It was proof that Siegel had been right all along, and also proof that visionaries never survive their own revolutions. He'd sometimes smile to himself and murmur, "You did it, kid. You just didn't get to see it." The Flamingo was now run by men who understood structure better than Siegel ever did. They cut deals quietly, avoided headlines, and kept the money flowing to the East Coast without interruption. Everything that had made Siegel dangerous, his temper, his pride, his need to be seen, was gone. The business had no face now, and that made it perfect. But still, something of him clung to the place. The staff swore they could feel it. Some said they'd seen him, a shadow passing through the halls late at night, a faint smell of cologne and gun smoke trailing behind. Others said that when the lights flickered unexpectedly, that was him reminding them he was still watching. For the people who had known him, those years were strange. Virginia Hill drifted from country to country, restless and bitter. She gave interviews sometimes, her voice cool and careful, every word chosen like a card she didn't want to show. "He was a genius," she said once, sitting in a Paris cafe, her dark glasses hiding the truth in her eyes. "But geniuses burn out. They don't fade." She never said more than that. Some nights, when she drank too much, She talked to friends about the early days in Hollywood, about the parties, about the desert before it became a city. He could make you believe in anything, she'd say softly, even the impossible. Back in America, Las Vegas grew like wildfire. New casinos rose almost overnight. The Sahara, the Sands, the Desert Inn, all following the template Siegel had drawn in blood. They were bigger, flashier, cleaner, but the soul was the same. Gambling, glamour, and the illusion of freedom. It was everything he had wanted and everything that had killed him. The irony didn't escape anyone who remembered. Bugsy would have loved this, they'd say, laughing, clinking their glasses together under the glow of the signs. It was easy to laugh now. The danger was gone, or at least hidden better. But not everyone forgot. There were men still alive who had stood beside Siegel when he'd made those promises, who'd seen him pacing across the desert with a cigarette in his hand, talking about the city he'd built. They carried those memories like ghosts of their own. To them, every success was a reminder of what it had cost. They didn't talk about it openly, but every time the syndicate opened a new resort, there was a quiet nod, a shared look, a silent acknowledgement. This was Benny's blueprint. The press kept his story alive, too. Magazines called him the man who built Las Vegas, the outlaw visionary, the romantic gangster who tried to turn crime into elegance. Hollywood followed. Movies started romanticizing his life, turning the violent, restless man into a myth of charm and tragedy. In those films, he was always the handsome rebel who wanted to make the world beautiful, a dreamer too good for the darkness around him. The truth was far messier, but truth rarely makes legends. And Siegel had become one. Even tourists who knew little about him could feel it. They'd walk through the Flamingo's grand lobby, unaware that the man whose name had once been spoken in fear had once sat in that very bar, arguing over floor plans and budgets. They'd smile for photographs in front of the neon sign that had cost him his life, oblivious to the blood that had watered the roots of this city. But perhaps that's what he wanted all along. He had built a place where sin and beauty could coexist, where people could forget. And now, millions were doing just that, forgetting him while living inside his dream. Meyer Lansky's influence kept Las Vegas stable in those years. He managed the flow of money, balanced the books, and avoided the chaos that had consumed Siegel. He made sure the casinos ran like clockwork. But for all his efficiency, he lacked the charisma that had once made the underworld feel like theater. Siegel had turned crime into spectacle. Lansky turned it into an institution. And while the money grew, something of the magic died. Vegas became smarter, richer, more controlled, but never again as wild, as reckless, as alive as when Siegel had walked its empty streets and seen the future. By 1952, the Flamingo had expanded twice, adding new wings, restaurants, and suites. The profits soared, and with every dollar, the myth of Siegel grew too. Writers started calling him the father of modern Las Vegas, and even the men who'd once cursed his name now smiled when they heard it. Success has a way of rewriting history. What had been madness was now genius. What had been betrayal was now vision. The past had been smoothed over by neon and money. Virginia Hill faded into exile, living in small apartments across Europe, her fortune dwindling. She still received money from old friends, quiet deposits that came without names, maybe from Lansky, maybe from others who felt they owed something to Siegel's ghost. She drank too much, spoke too little, and avoided mirrors. The newspapers still chased her, asking about Benny, about the Flamingo, about the night in Beverly Hills. He wasn't afraid, she said in one rare interview. He knew it was coming. He just wanted to look good when it happened. There was pride in her voice when she said it, and sadness too. She knew what it meant to love a man like that, to love a man who belonged to his own legend more than he ever belonged to her. The syndicate kept expanding westward. They moved into Reno, San Francisco, even Los Angeles again, but Vegas was their masterpiece. It was the perfect front: legal gambling, endless cash, no paper trails. Politicians smiled, the police looked the other way, and the tourists came by the thousands. The city that had once been built by criminals now sold itself as paradise. And in that contradiction lay Siegel's final victory. He had wanted to make crime beautiful, and he had. The beauty just didn't save him. By 1955, the Flamingo was a symbol of everything America wanted to believe about itself: freedom, success, reinvention. No one cared that it had been built with stolen money and blood. They only cared that it shined. At night, when the lights came on, it looked like a city floating in the darkness, untouchable, eternal. The tourists smiled and gambled, and somewhere in the hum of the machines, in the rhythm of dice rolling across green felt, there was still the echo of Siegel's laughter. In private moments, Lansky sometimes visited his grave. He never brought flowers, never spoke long, but he always stood there in silence for a while, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the stone. He'd think about all the times they'd walked together through Brooklyn's alleys, all the nights they'd planned the future, all the promises made before ambition turned to blood. He knew Siegel had been impossible, infuriating, dangerous, but he had also been right. Without him, the syndicate would never have seen what Las Vegas could be. "You got there first," Lansky would mutter quietly before walking away. The years rolled forward, and the legend deepened. Siegel became the ghost of the Flamingo, not the kind that haunts with fear, but the kind that whispers to the dreamers who walk through the city at night. Every hustler, every builder, every showman who came after him carried a piece of his madness, a trace of that same hunger. They didn't need to know his name to feel it. The city itself was his monument, his voice echoing through the slot machines and the laughter, reminding everyone who dared to build something bigger than themselves that vision always comes with a price. Sometimes, when the desert wind blew just right, it sounded like a whisper through the lights, soft, almost human. And if you listened closely, you could almost hear it. The ghost of the man who had dreamed this city into being, still walking the strip he'd carved out of nothing, still smiling that quiet, dangerous smile, still watching over the kingdom he built from dust. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel's story ended in a chair in Beverly Hills, but his shadow never left the desert. The Flamingo was his final creation, his masterpiece, and his curse. And though decades have passed, every time the sun sets and the lights of Las Vegas blaze to life, he rises again with them, a reminder that dreams built on danger never really die. They just keep glowing, eternal, under the endless Nevada sky. Chapter 13, The City of Light and Sin, 1955 to 1960. By the mid-1950s, Las Vegas was no longer a mirage in the desert. It was real, alive, and glittering like a jewel under the Nevada sun. The highways that once cut through silence were now rivers of cars, headlights gliding toward a city that never slept. From the air, it looked almost unnatural, a sea of light rising from emptiness, defying the sand and sky. The Flamingo still stood tall, its pink glow shimmering in the heat like a memory that refused to fade, but now it was surrounded by a skyline of neon empires. The city Benjamin Bugsy Siegel had dreamed into being was no longer his alone. It had grown beyond him, swallowing the desert whole. And in doing so, it had become a reflection of everything he had ever wanted, beautiful, dangerous, and impossible to control. The 1950s brought a new kind of power to Las Vegas. It was no longer the risky experiment of outlaws and visionaries. It had become an institution, a playground for the powerful. Casinos rose like monuments. The Sands, the Riviera, the Dunes, the Stardust, each one bigger and brighter than the last. The mob's money built them, but Hollywood's faces gave them glamour. Frank Sinatra crooned at the Sands, Dean Martin cracked jokes between card hands, and Sammy Davis Jr. danced under the shimmering lights of the Copa Room. The Rat Pack made the desert look like paradise, a place where danger wore a tuxedo and sin came with a smile. To the tourists flooding in from across the country, it wasn't crime, it was charm. They didn't see the blood under the marble floors or the deals made in shadows. They saw only the glow. Behind that glow, though, the syndicate was tightening its grip. The bosses back east had realized what Siegel had known years earlier. Las Vegas wasn't just a city. It was a machine, one that could clean dirty money until it shone. The cash that poured into those casinos came from all directions: gambling, drugs, loans, extortion, and it flowed back out washed, legitimate, untouchable. The FBI suspected it, the newspapers hinted at it, but no one could prove it. The men who ran the city were careful. They had learned from Siegel's mistakes. They stayed in the background, faceless, invisible. The real power in Las Vegas no longer wore diamonds and silk. It wore silence. Still, there was a certain poetry to how everything had turned out. The city that killed its creator had become his monument. The very things that destroyed him, his ambition, his extravagance, his belief that crime could be beautiful, had become the foundation for the new Vegas. Tourists walked through the casinos, never knowing that the carpet beneath their feet was laid by men who once ruled with bullets instead of contracts. They didn't know that the elegance around them had been born for blood. But if you listen closely, under the laughter and the music, there was always that hum of tension, the same one Siegel had lived with until his last breath. The city carried his pulse like a secret heartbeat. The Flamingo, now thriving, was still the heart of the Strip. It had been renovated, expanded, polished into perfection. The ghosts of its chaotic beginnings had been scrubbed away, replaced by velvet, gold, and the smell of expensive perfume. To the casual visitor, it looked timeless, as if it had always been there. But for the old-timers, the dealers, the doormen, the pit bosses, it still belonged to Benny. They'd tell stories when the nights slowed down, when the gamblers were drunk, and the music turned low. He built this, they'd say softly. He saw it before anyone else did. Some of them swore they could still feel him watching, walking through the halls in that white suit, eyes sharp, grin faint, cigarette in hand. The mob's control of Las Vegas deepened with each passing year. Money flowed from the East Coast like water through hidden pipelines. The Teamsters Union became the quiet banker of the underworld, funneling pension funds into casino construction. Skim operations took a slice of every profit before it ever reached the books. The government tried to fight it, but the system was too slick, too well-oiled. Vegas was clean on paper, dirty in reality. The bosses didn't need to hide. They just needed to smile. For the tourists, none of that mattered. They came in droves, chasing the fantasy that Las Vegas sold so well: freedom. Here, you could be anyone, do anything, lose everything, and still feel alive. Men who worked 9-to-5 jobs in cities far away found themselves at blackjack tables at 3 a.m, grinning like kids. Women in sequin dresses sipped martinis under chandeliers, their laughter echoing through rooms designed to feel like eternity. It was the American dream stripped of morality, dressed in neon and champagne. And it worked. By the late 1950s, Vegas was earning more money than anyone had imagined. The casinos were printing cash, and the desert had become a beacon for those who believed they could outsmart fate. But beneath that success, there was an unease that never went away. The FBI had begun watching closer, sending agents into the city disguised as gamblers and businessmen. Wiretaps crackled in secret offices across Nevada, collecting fragments of conversations that hinted at corruption stretching from the Strip to Chicago, from the casinos to Congress. The walls were closing in, slowly but surely. But for the men in charge, the danger only added to the thrill. In the midst of this, old figures from Siegel's world began to fade. Some retired quietly, others disappeared without warning. Meyer Lansky kept his head down, moving money, keeping books balanced, always a step ahead of the law. He rarely spoke of Siegel anymore, though those who knew him said the subject still made his jaw tighten. To him, Benny had been both a brother and a lesson, a reminder that genius without discipline was a death sentence. Yet every time he walked the Strip, he couldn't escape the feeling that he was walking through Siegel's dream. No matter how big the city grew, it still bore his fingerprints. Hollywood, too, had fallen deeper in love with the myth of the man and the city. Films romanticized the mobsters, the gamblers, the women who lived fast and burned out young. To audiences, Las Vegas was the modern frontier. a place where law stopped and luck began. The newspapers might have called Siegel a gangster, but the movies turned him into something else entirely. A tragic hero who tried to build beauty out of corruption. And in a way, that wasn't wrong. Every great empire is built on contradiction, and Siegel had embodied that better than anyone. The city itself seemed to play along with his ghost. Every new casino outshone the last, chasing the same impossible perfection that had driven him mad. Architects competed to build bigger, brighter, more audacious monuments to excess. The Strip became a kind of fever dream, each light competing to outshine the one beside it. It was no longer about gambling. It was about spectacle. The city had learned Siegel's final lesson. People don't come for cards or dice. They come to feel invincible. And yet, for all its success, there were nights when the desert reminded everyone of what had come before. The wind would blow across the sand, rattling the signs, carrying a low whistle that sounded like laughter or warning. There were dealers who swore they saw a reflection in the casino mirrors that didn't belong to anyone in the room. Guests who said they felt watched when they walked past the old Flamingo suite that had once been Siegel's. The management brushed it off as superstition, but some things in Las Vegas are too strange to explain. The city was built on ghosts, of money, of ambition, of men who had wanted too much. By the end of the decade, Las Vegas had become everything Siegel had promised and everything he feared. It was powerful but hollow, dazzling but dangerous. The mob still ran the show, but now the stakes were higher. Government eyes were on them. Competition was fierce, and the cracks were beginning to show. The city was expanding faster than it could handle. Money had made it immortal, but greed was beginning to eat at its edges. The empire of light was starting to flicker. Still, the legend of Bugsy Siegel only grew stronger. Writers called him the man who built paradise. Tourists told stories of the gangster who dreamed of a city where everyone could be free. Even the mobsters who had once hated his extravagance now toasted his name. He was ahead of his time, they'd say, raising their glasses over the same tables he once dreamed over. Time had turned him from cautionary tale into martyr. He had died too young, too bold, too beautifully for them to remember him any other way. In truth, Siegel's legacy was more complicated than myth could capture. He hadn't just built a city. He had built an idea. Las Vegas was a mirror of human desire, reflecting everything people loved and feared about themselves. It was proof that if you give someone a place to chase pleasure without consequence, they will build an altar to it. And in that altar, Siegel's ghost still smiled. The city was his masterpiece, even if it was also his grave. By 1960, the Strip stretched miles beyond the Flamingo, glowing brighter than any skyline in the country. Airplanes flying overhead could see it long before they saw anything else. A river of light cutting through the black desert. The money was endless, the crowds unstoppable, the fantasy eternal. And yet, beneath it all, the same story kept repeating. Ambition, betrayal, reinvention. The pattern that had defined Siegel's life had become the heartbeat of Las Vegas itself. It was a city that never learned moderation, that never slowed down, that never looked back. But every light eventually burns out. For now, though, the city didn't care. The people laughed, the dice rolled, the money changed hands, and the Flamingo's pink glow still ruled the night. The world had forgotten the man who built it, but the city never had. You could feel him there, in the hum of the neon, in the rhythm of the roulette wheel, in the quiet just before dawn when the last gamblers stumbled out into the desert wind. His story had ended years ago, but his dream had become immortal. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel's city was no longer a vision. It was reality. And yet, every time the sun rose over the endless Nevada sand, painting the Strip in soft gold, it was as if the city whispered his name one more time, just to remember where it came from. The gangster was gone, but the dreamer remained, woven into every light that refused to go dark. Las Vegas had become everything he'd imagined and everything he died for, a city of light and sin, of beauty and betrayal, forever chasing the ghost of the man who had built it from nothing. Chapter 14. The Mirage of Immortality, 1960 to 1970. The 1960s began with Las Vegas shimmering brighter than ever, a mirage of wealth and vice that no longer looked like the outlaw outpost Benjamin Bugsy Siegel had once risked everything to build. From the desert sky, the city looked almost divine, a glowing serpent of light twisting across black emptiness, drawing pilgrims of greed and glamour from every corner of the country. The Strip stretched further now, lined with palaces of pleasure, each more ostentatious than the last. The sands, the stardust, the Riviera, the dunes, and at the heart of it all, the Flamingo, still proud, still pulsing with life. Siegel's ghost lingered there, in the hum of neon and the shuffle of cards, watching the empire that had cost him his life bloom into an empire that seemed immortal. But immortality in Las Vegas was always an illusion. Beneath the flashing lights, the same darkness moved silently. The mob still ran the city with invisible hands, skimming profits, buying silence, and keeping their names out of the headlines. The money that glittered on the surface hid a labyrinth of corruption below. Politicians took bribes, judges looked away, and the FBI, though louder now, was still a step behind. Everyone knew who owned Las Vegas, but no one dared to say it out loud. It was a city where truth was just another gamble, and every player had something to lose. The 1960s brought a new kind of chaos to the city Siegel had dreamed of. The old guard of gangsters was aging, their power slipping like sand through their fingers. The world outside Las Vegas was changing. Civil rights marches filled the streets of America. The war in Vietnam raged on televisions, and new counterculture questioned every institution built by men like Siegel. But in Las Vegas, time stood still. The casinos still sparkled, the drinks still flowed, and the illusion of endless prosperity still blinded everyone to what was coming. The city thrived on denial, and no one understood denial better than those who built it. Inside the Flamingo, the nights were as wild as ever. The Rat Pack ruled the stage. Sinatra, Dean, Sammy, Peter, and Joey, turning the casino into a temple of charisma and vice. Their shows were the stuff of legend. Laughter, whiskey, and songs that made sin sound like salvation. People packed the rooms just to be close to that kind of power, that kind of freedom. They came for the glamour, for the stories they could tell later, for the feeling that they were part of something untouchable. But behind the curtain, the old machinery still turned. Skim money was still moved in briefcases, blood debts were still collected quietly, and the men who smiled from the shadows still decided who lived and who disappeared. To the world, Las Vegas was the crown of the American dream, a place where anyone could win, where luck replaced destiny. But to the men who controlled it, it was just a business. Every coin dropped into a slot machine was counted before it ever hit the tray. Every bet, every show, every smile from a dealer was part of a system designed to look effortless and feel eternal. The myth of Vegas was that it couldn't die. The truth was that it had already begun to rot from the inside. Meyer Lansky watched it all unfold from afar. Older now, quieter, he had turned from kingmaker to caretaker. He had seen his friends fall one by one, some to bullets, some to prison, some to time. He knew the FBI was circling, building cases that would one day make headlines. The men who once ruled the underworld with iron fists were being replaced by accountants, lawyers, and politicians who knew how to hide corruption behind paperwork. It was a different kind of control, colder and smarter. Lansky had always believed in order, in precision, but even he could feel the shift. The world that he and Siegel had built was ending. And yet, Siegel's ghost refused to fade. His legend only grew with each passing year. Journalists wrote retrospectives about him, painting him as the visionary who saw Las Vegas before anyone else could. Films began to borrow pieces of his story, turning him into an archetype, the gangster with dreams too big for his own world. His violence was softened, his ambition romanticized. The public forgot the blood, the fear, the chaos. They remembered only the dream, the handsome outlaw who built paradise from dust and paid for it with his life. It was everything he could have wanted, and nothing he ever got to see. The city he created mirrored him perfectly, beautiful, restless, and haunted. Every light that flickered in the desert carried a piece of his ambition. But even ambition has a cost, and by the mid-1960s, Las Vegas was paying it. The mob had grown too comfortable, too greedy. Money that once flowed smoothly through hidden channels now spilled into places it shouldn't. Politicians demanded bigger payoffs. Law enforcement demanded attention. The FBI began to infiltrate the city, slowly but persistently, planting agents where no one expected them. There were whispers that J. Edgar Hoover himself had a fascination with Las Vegas, a mix of disgust and obsession. He saw the city as a stain on America's image, a symbol of corruption hiding behind sequins and showgirls. But even Hoover couldn't resist the charm. He visited once under the guise of business, sitting quietly at a poker table while pretending not to stare at the spectacle around him. Everyone wanted a piece of the dream, even the men who wanted to destroy it. Meanwhile, the casinos continued to multiply. The Stardust became the biggest operation on the Strip, a monument to excess that made Siegel's Flamingo look quaint by comparison. The Riviera expanded, the Sahara thrived, and the Sands became the social hub of the nation's elite. Politicians, entertainers, and mobsters rubbed shoulders in its lounges, laughing like old friends while pretending not to notice the guns tucked under tailored suits. Las Vegas had become the great equalizer, where senators and killers could share the same bottle and leave their sins at the door. But as the decade wore on, the cracks widened. The Cuban Revolution had destroyed many of Lansky's offshore investments, tightening the noose around organized crime in America. The syndicate began to rely even more heavily on Las Vegas, and that dependence made them reckless. The skimming operations became riskier, the money trails harder to hide. The casinos were expanding too fast, the profits too tempting. Everyone wanted a bigger cut, and that greed, inevitable, corrosive, was starting to eat away at the foundation Siegel had built. In those years, the Flamingo stood like a monument to a ghost. It was no longer the most modern, no longer the biggest, but it remained the most symbolic. Tourists still flocked there, drawn by the legend as much as the luxury. They bought postcards, drank cocktails named after him, and posed in front of the pink neon sign that bore no trace of the blood it had cost. To them, Siegel was history, a name whispered in thrill and disbelief. To the men who had known him, he was still a reminder, a warning that even legends could bleed. Virginia Hill had faded into near obscurity by then. Her beauty had dimmed, her fortune gone, her name half forgotten by the newspapers that once chased her. She lived quietly in Europe, giving rare interviews where she spoke of Siegel with a strange tenderness. He was never afraid, she said in one of her last public appearances. He used to say the only real death is being forgotten. And he was right. Her eyes glimmered when she said it, as though she knew she was already slipping into that same oblivion. Back in America, Siegel's legend kept feeding the city that killed him. His story was retold in nightclubs, dramatized in radio specials, whispered by taxi drivers who drove past the Flamingo's glowing facade. That's where it started, they'd say. That's where he dreamed it all up. The tourists listened, wide-eyed, imagining the gangster-turned-visionary standing under the desert stars, cigarette glowing, eyes fixed on the horizon. They didn't know the truth of what it cost, and maybe that was the point. Vegas thrived on stories more than it ever did on truth. By the late 1960s, the FBI had begun connecting the dots. Wiretaps revealed the networks of mob influence that stretched from Chicago to Kansas City to the Strip. The first rumblings of federal cases against casino owners began to shake the underworld. The old generation, the men who had built Vegas from shadows, knew the end was near. The city was changing. Corporate money was moving in. Legitimate businessmen were starting to buy the casinos, washing away the last traces of the syndicate with clean contracts and legal fronts. It was the beginning of the end for the mob's Las Vegas, but the start of something else, something Siegel had once envisioned before anyone else. He had wanted the city to be bigger than the men who built it, and now it was. It was becoming an empire that didn't need the underworld to survive. That irony would have made him laugh. The mob had killed him for dreaming too far ahead, only to watch his dream outgrow their control. The 1960s ended the way Siegel's life had ended, brilliant, chaotic, and full of ghosts. The city had survived, but the men who created it were vanishing. The old mobsters were either dead or dying, their names fading from the news as their casinos changed hands. The new owners wore suits instead of scars, but the hunger was the same. Las Vegas was still built on sin. It had just learned how to hide it better. The dream was intact, the illusion stronger than ever. The mirage of immortality was complete. At night, when the lights of the Strip blazed across the desert, they reached further than anyone had thought possible. Airplanes flying over Nevada could see it from miles away, a golden river cutting through the void. It was more than a city now. It was an idea, a living, breathing fantasy where the past never really died. It just kept dealing new hands. And somewhere in the middle of it all, under the pink glow of the Flamingo, the ghost of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel still lingered, smiling that same knowing smile, the one that said he had seen it all before anyone else, and that the game was still his, even in death. He had once said the desert would remember him, that his name would live in the lights. And it had. Every flicker, every hum, every roll of the dice was a whisper of his ambition, echoing across time. The man who built paradise from nothing had lost his life for it, but his dream had outlived them all. The city he built had achieved the immortality he always wanted, an immortality made not of life, but of legend. And as the wind moved through the neon canyons of Las Vegas, it carried the faintest sound, like a promise kept, the low, distant laughter of the man who dared to believe that even death couldn't stop the lights from shining. Chapter 15. The Legacy of a Ghost, 1970, present day. The years rolled on, and the city Benjamin Bugsy Siegel built refused to die. By the early 1970s, Las Vegas had transformed once again, no longer just a gangster's playground, but an empire of neon and steel, built on the bones of men who had dreamed too big and burned too fast. The Flamingo still stood, proud and glittering, its pink lights cutting through the night like a heartbeat that never stopped. Tourists filled its halls, gambling away their paychecks under chandeliers that once dripped with blood, oblivious to the history buried beneath their feet. They didn't know the name of the man who had first seen this place in his mind, long before it existed. They didn't know that the air they breathed was still heavy with his ghost. But the city did. Las Vegas never forgot its maker. It just learned to hide him in plain sight. By 1970, the old world of organized crime was beginning to unravel. The FBI had turned its full attention toward the mob, armed with new laws, wiretaps, and witnesses ready to talk. The men who had once walked the Strip like kings were now facing indictments, prison sentences, and betrayal from their own. Meyer Lansky, the architect who had once balanced the syndicate's books with mathematical precision, found himself under investigation for tax evasion and conspiracy. He was older now, quieter, almost fragile. The man who had once shaped empires through whispers was watching the last traces of that empire crumble into dust. He had survived everything except time. Yet even as the walls closed in, he refused to speak Siegel's name to the authorities. "He was my friend," he said once when pressed. "And friends don't talk about ghosts." The mob's influence over Las Vegas began to fade as corporations moved in, buying casinos one by one. The city was changing again, this time trading violence for legitimacy, blood for bureaucracy. The names above the doors shifted from family-run operations to publicly traded companies. The skimming stopped, but the hunger didn't. Vegas had always been about greed. It just wore a cleaner suit now. The money flowed in rivers, the hotels grew taller, and the dreams got bigger. But even as the skyline changed, the story remained the same. Every light on the Strip still burned in the shape of Siegel's vision. The Flamingo had survived it all. The mob wars, the FBI, the changing tides of history. It was renovated, expanded, modernized, its bones reshaped with glass and marble. But at its heart, it was still his creation. Somewhere under all that shine, beneath the carpets and walls, the original floor Siegel had walked on still remained, a hidden relic of the past. Dealers who worked the night shift swore that sometimes, in the quiet hours just before dawn, they could feel a presence, a strange calm that settled over the room like memory. They called it Benny's hour, the moment between night and morning when the lights felt softer and the city seemed to breathe. Some said they'd seen him, just a flicker, a reflection in a mirror, a shadow at the edge of their vision. Maybe it was imagination. Maybe not. In Vegas, ghosts are good for business. By the 1980s, Las Vegas had entered a new age of spectacle. The corporations that took over didn't just build casinos, they built worlds. The Mirage rose like a golden temple in the sand, followed by the Bellagio, Caesar's Palace, and the MGM Grand, each one grander than the last. The mob was gone from the headlines, but its legacy lived in the DNA of the city. The structure, the deals, the mindset, it was all still there, just hidden behind contracts instead of guns. And at the root of it all, the seed that had grown into this endless garden of lights still belonged to Siegel. His idea had been simple but revolutionary. Make sin beautiful. Dress greed in gold and call it entertainment. And the world had followed. As decades passed, his legend transformed. History books softened his name, turning the violent, impulsive man into a misunderstood visionary. He became the romantic outlaw, the charming dreamer cut down too soon, the tragic hero of the American underworld. Films portrayed him with grace, his rough edges smoothed away, his cruelty replaced by charisma. Warren Beatty played him in Bugsy, giving his story the Hollywood polish he always chased in life. The movie made him larger than life all over again, reminding the world that the man who built Las Vegas wasn't just a gangster. He was a symbol of ambition itself. And ambition, like Las Vegas, never really dies. For those who knew the truth, the myth was bittersweet. They remembered the real Siegel, the rage behind the smile, the paranoia that grew heavier with every dollar spent, the fire that burned too hot for anyone to stand too close. He wasn't just a visionary. He was dangerous. He was brilliant and broken, a man who could charm a room one minute and destroy it the next. The city he created mirrored him perfectly, beautiful on the surface, ruthless beneath. Every success it achieved carried his contradictions. Every loss echoed his fate. Las Vegas was the living reflection of Benjamin Siegel, seductive, reckless, unstoppable. In the 1990s, as the city grew into a global phenomenon, a new generation of tourists arrived, people who had never heard of Siegel but lived inside his legacy. They came for the shows, the gambling, the lights, never realizing that they were walking through a story written in blood. The Flamingo became a relic of nostalgia, a place where the old and new Vegas met. It was no longer the flashiest, no longer the most luxurious, but it was eternal. The hotel began showcasing its history proudly. In one corner, a small bronze plaque appeared, dedicated to the man who had founded it all. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, it read. Visionary, builder, dreamer. No mention of murder. No mention of a syndicate. Just 3 words that turned a gangster into a legend. Visitors posed for pictures beside it, smiling, unaware that the man behind that name had died violently for daring to believe the desert could shine. But that was how Siegel would have wanted it. He wanted immortality, not pity. In some strange way, he got both. The city had outlived everyone who had built it, but his shadow remained the longest. Even as new towers rose, his ghost stayed in the walls of the Flamingo, in the rhythm of the city he conjured. The mob was long gone by the turn of the millennium. The corporations owned everything now, casinos, hotels, even the dreams. Vegas had become a machine of capitalism, churning 24 hours a day, consuming desire and spitting out profit. But beneath the sleek facades, the soul of the city hadn't changed. The gamblers still came seeking luck. The lost still came seeking redemption. and the lights still burned through the night like a promise. It was still the city of sin, still the mirage in the desert, still the place Siegel saw when no one else could. And maybe that's why his legend still matters. In a world obsessed with reinvention, Siegel's story is a reminder that some dreams are worth dying for, even if they destroy their creators. He didn't build Las Vegas because he wanted money. He built it because he wanted immortality. He wanted to be remembered as more than just another gangster with a gun. He wanted to create something beautiful, something eternal, something that would prove that men like him could do more than kill and steal. And in that sense, he succeeded. The city became his monument, the lights his afterlife. Even today, when night falls and the strip glows brighter than the stars above it, his presence is everywhere. You can feel it in the hum of the air, in the way the neon signs flicker like living things, in the heat that never really fades. The dealers at the Flamingo still tell stories to new staff members about the man who started it all. He was crazy, they say. But look around. Maybe crazy was exactly what the desert needed. The tourists laugh, not realizing how true that is. In 2017, 70 years after his death, the Flamingo celebrated its anniversary with fireworks and fanfare. The guests toasted champagne in rooms that had once been crime scenes. The news anchors talked about history, progress, legacy. Few mentioned Siegel's name, but the irony hung heavy in the air. The hotel he built, the dream he died for, had outlived every enemy who tried to erase him. The empire of sand had become eternal. Somewhere beyond the lights, where the desert stretches quiet and endless, there's a different kind of silence, the kind that belongs to memory. That's where Siegel's story really lives. Out there, under the vast black sky, you can almost see him the way he was at the beginning. A young man in a crisp suit, cigarette glowing in the dark, his eyes full of something the world couldn't understand yet. He's standing on a patch of barren land, the wind whipping around him, and he's smiling. Not because he's won, but because he knows he's right. In that moment, the desert is empty, but in his mind, it's already alive, with lights, music, laughter, and the promise of something greater than himself. That's how legends are born, not from perfection, but from madness. Siegel's madness built a city. His vision turned dust into gold. His death turned failure into myth. And every time someone walks into a casino, tosses a coin into a slot machine, or looks up at the endless glow of Las Vegas and whispers, "Wow," they're paying tribute to him, whether they know it or not. He wanted the world to remember his name, and it has, though not in the way he imagined. Time has a strange way of forgiving the bold. History smooths the edges, paints villains as dreamers, and turns crime into folklore. In that process, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel became more than a man. He became a symbol of ambition unbound, of risk taken without restraint, of the thin line between vision and vanity. The city he built remains both his triumph and his tombstone, a living contradiction that glows eternal against the desert night. And so, when the sun sets over Nevada and the strip lights up again, it's easy to imagine that somewhere in the glow, his spirit stirs. Maybe he's leaning against a wall in the Flamingo's lobby, watching the crowds, a half-smile playing on his lips. Maybe he's standing by the roulette wheel, cigarette smoke curling in the air, whispering to the dealers to keep the game going. Maybe he's just part of the light now, the pulse that keeps the city alive. Because Las Vegas was never just a place, it was a promise that dreams, no matter how dangerous, could outlive the dreamers. A promise that the impossible could be built from nothing. And that promise was Siegel's gift to the world. The man is gone, the myth remains, and the lights still burn. The desert that once swallowed him now glows with his memory, a city forever awake, forever hungry, forever his. The ghost of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel lives on, not in the shadows, but in the shine, the eternal reflection of a man who dared to believe that even outlaws could build something beautiful that would never die.